Chapter 221. Missionary 3. Why? Why are you all acting like this? Richard didn't understand at that moment. Perhaps it was because he was too intoxicated by the pleasure of authority and power. In his mind, these people were ones who would nod and applaud when he spoke. They had done so until now, and it seemed they would continue to do so. But now these people were either avoiding his gaze in embarrassment or glaring at him in anger. One of them spoke. How would you feel if you heard that your ancestors were burning in eternal flames? Your words make no sense. Why should our father go to hell? Just because he didn't know that someone died and came back to life across that vast ocean. Even though there was no one to tell him. That's right. How can that be? You must be mistaken, right? Our grandmother was never unkind to those around her. Not even for a moment. How could such a person go to hell? Looking at the waves of words full of lamentation and anger rushing in, Richard belatedly thought, "Be careful. Since you were ordained as a priest not long ago, I must tell you to be careful not to dismiss them as barbarians or rashly consider their customs as devil worship." The merchants had said so. Those who would now be going around asking about the intention to participate in gift exchanges with the community, those who would be inoculating people by squeezing cow pus. Richard realized his mistake and lamented belatedly. Shouldn't have been like this. How could I not view them as barbarians? Those who do not go through our Lord Jesus Christ naturally go to hell. That is the obvious truth. If you remain in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. John 8 verses 32 to 33. Look, even the Holy Scriptures say so. It's foolish that they still haven't realized their ignorance despite my zealous proclamation about him who is the way, the truth, and the life. Because the loving and merciful Jesus Christ bore the cross, we sinners have obtained a way to become like angels only through him. How can you question this? Everything in the world depends on God's will. Everything in the world is under God's sovereignty. Those who follow and obey him go to heaven, and those who disobey him go to hell. These are predetermined events, so to add words against them is blasphemy and losing to Satan's voice. Nonsense. Our grandmother never disobeyed. How could they disobey something they didn't even know about? Are you trying to understand his will with human intentions? He would have sent to hell those whom he would send to hell. But didn't he send me like this to save you? Then believe in me. Follow me to the Lord's side. Why on earth should we believe such a thing? Damn. Bewitched by strange words until now. People rushed away from him like that. Richard also shouted in anger and frustration. Fine. Go. You servants of Satan. You were not destined to be saved, but were born to be abandoned forever and burn in hell. Those barbarians, offspring of serpents, sons like Judas, damned cannibals. I must have been crazy to try to save such things. After venting his intense anger and hatred in his youthful energy, Richard sighed and looked around. There were still dozens of people remaining in their seats. In their eyes, there seemed to be burning fear of the Lord, reverence, and thorough faith. Richard pulled himself together, seeing those who remained believing in him. Right? Isn't it enough to save these people from death first? He could find out about the rest of the people through his future actions, whether the Lord had determined them to be recipients of his love or not. Let us all pray for those foolish ones. We will someday be able to rescue them from death. From here, the conquest begins. The Holy Church will finally begin its fight for the Lord from this place. Richard clenched his fist and shouted. The people at this place, remember the following words from Matthew 10 verses 35 to 38. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be those of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. Swear from now on to sever all ties with family, friends, and neighbors, leaving only your tie with the Lord. If you don't, truly, unquenchable flames will be waiting for you." And he approached a young woman sitting closest to him and spoke in a threatening manner. "Will you swear?" I ask. "Will you swear?" I will swear." "And you? You in the back, will you swear?" "I will swear." "Good. All who still remain here, gather over here, and kneel and make the oath with me." And so he made dozens of people kneel, gave them improvised baptism again, and held a service. Believing that this hardship, this terrible mass apostasy, was a trial preparing for the days of glory that would someday come. You really must be careful. Please consider yourself the pillar of our community. If there's danger, make sure to avoid it. Of course, please tell the other council members to take care of the community while I'm gone. Understood. And I'm curious about exactly what frictions led to this commotion. Could you tell me again? Yes. Our missionary declared that their ancestors would go to hell, threatened local shamans, and is said to be kidnapping people by leading some tribe members out to live communally. Hewitt bit his lip unknowingly as he gave the explanation. He had deliberately selected only people with serious and quiet personalities as missionaries to prevent such incidents, and had personally educated each one in detail. Despite having conducted missions with dozens of tribes, the fact that there had not been a single accident proved the effectiveness of those efforts. But the problem was that recently, as the community's expansion speed became too fast, they hastily hired former pastors or priests without verification. No, if he had managed more carefully. Chapter 222. Missionary 4. Thank you. Please just give me the information about that missionary. Here it is. Richard Peterson. Scottish, 26 years old, male. Hewitt bowed his head, feeling the weight of responsibility at the other's calm attitude. Good. This should be enough to know. Then I'll be going. Don't blame yourself too much. It's my responsibility too. Taking the materials Hewitt handed over, he slowly boarded the ship. With a benevolent smile, he patted Hewitt's shoulder. This seemed to somewhat calm Hewitt's churning anguish. Hewitt quietly watched the ship move and offered a prayer. Even the information he just gave contains news with a time lag of 1 to 1.5 months. More might have happened in the meantime, and the more that happened, the more serious the situation might have become. Sigh. Perhaps the Virginia community would become explicitly hostile to another tribe for the first time. Perhaps there would be war. Whatever happened, it needed to be resolved by any means. But he was also afraid that he might overexert himself. A person who ran for days on end to save people from a storm. As Hewitt raised his head, murmuring thus, his face at the bow had hardened, like a rock. Whoosh. As a basket filled with tobacco leaves is burned, everyone at the gathering becomes immersed in a feeling of awakening. As the elder recites something and offers thanks to the spirits, people listen to him reverently. In the midst of this sacred event, praise the glory of the Lord. Some people shout from afar, interrupting the elder's speech. For there is one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in you all. Ephesians 4 verse 5. We again to the one who rules the earth. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them nor serve them. Exodus 20 verses 4 to 5. Teach those must be driven away. As the elder rises, saying this, he sees his daughter beyond the fence. His daughter was muttering something like a madwoman, sometimes shouting, "For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God." Exodus 20 verse 5. And as the elder steps forward with a dejected expression, others rush in, throwing stones at him to prevent him from approaching, and take away his 17-year-old daughter. The elder shouts, "They're kidnapping my daughter. Those things are kidnapping my daughter whom I haven't seen for days." At those words, other people rise to quickly chase after them. but all they hear is shouting in a clumsy foreigner's accent. Your daughter came to us of her own will. Come onwari. Tell them. Father? The pastor said that for our family not to all go to hell, at least I should come. I want you all to follow later. Please, because I don't want my loved ones to suffer eternally. This is, damn it. Don't listen to that damned person's words and come here right now. And no. Going to hell. And they quickly flee into the bushes and disappear. People could only watch them, afraid of hurting the elder's daughter even as they tried to chase after them with weapons. And the elder's daughter, Onwari, returns to their own village, crying heavily, following the words of Richard and others, to the village of the saved ones. As Richard, who has returned after disrupting their devil worship ceremony and rescuing another convert, looks around and checks attendance. There are a couple missing? What should we do? Again, people had escaped. At the villagers' report, Richard clicks his tongue and shakes his head. In the end, unbelievers with weak will cannot be trusted. How can one seek the momentary and lose eternal life? Thinking this, Richard orders his followers to return to their respective homes and seek sleep in his hut. After waking up a few hours later, Father Richard? Why are you here? Your expression has become quite fierce. At those words, Richard looks at his face reflected in the water. His eyes have become somewhat fierce, and his cheeks have hollowed. Soot is stuck on various parts of his unwashed face. But what would they know? As he clicks his tongue again and glares, the merchants shrink back and say, We have sent a letter to the homeland. Soon, someone will come to judge your wickedness. Perhaps Nemo himself might come. It's that kind of matter. Wickedness. Goodness, are you asking because you don't know? How many of their sanctuaries have you defiled? How many of their people have you kidnapped? Apart from everything else, what are you trying to do to the relationship between our community and this tribal confederation? Have you gone mad? Click. Did you just point a gun at us? Get out. Didn't I just say get out? And I've never kidnapped anyone. They all came on their own feet. I just told them to cut off all previous ties. Is that a problem? Becoming a true Christian. He's mad. Completely mad. Get out. The frightened merchants leave his hut. Coming out, they seem to be preparing to leave this place altogether, packing their belongings and leaving the village among themselves. Rather, it's a relief. He hadn't liked their talk about the homeland and the community's rules from the beginning. They are people who prioritize laws made by humans over the Lord's law. Richard shakes his head and just chews over one of their words. Perhaps Nemo himself might come. It's that kind of matter. The emotion Richard felt was not tension. Neither fear, nor regret, nor reverence. Surprisingly, Richard feels hope and joy rising in his heart. He might come. As he steps outside, he sees several Mohawk people offering prayers at the cross erected in the center of the village for morning prayer time. He smiled contentedly at the sight, and as he approaches among them, everyone flinches and looks up at Richard. Richard was their chief, their ruler. They believed in Richard as they believed in God. Chapter 223, Missionary 5. Richard quietly sighs and stands before them, and with his back to the cross he shouted, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. John 14 verse 6, the path to salvation is narrow. And we are heading very well along that narrow path. Do not believe the words of others, but only believe the word of the Lord. Soon his glory and authority will come to this land. Deviating from the narrow path is death and eternal punishment. Everyone stay alert. Richard, intoxicated by his own speech, said, He is coming soon. Yes, glory was not far off. At first, there might be conflict. Those unbelieving merchants would have distorted his deeds in their report. But if he gradually approaches him and tells him what he has done for him and the Lord's glory, he will smile and embrace him. and he will greatly use me. In this land, I will lead thousands and tens of thousands of believers, and this small village will someday become the site of a great chapel. Thus he would live in overflowing glory. As the first to spread the gospel in this land, his picture would be hung on the wall of that chapel. With an ecstatic heart, he came down from the podium again and finished his day's work with various labors. And he made plans. He had thought about raiding their so-called sanctuary and destroying the idols. It would be exhilarating. Many prophets of the Old Testament era destroyed and toppled pagan temples and idols, so how could it not be worth emulating? Also, he had thought about stealing children from the villages of barbarians. They would not only be hostages to recruit those devil worshippers but also for the children themselves. If they weren't baptized and made Christians, they would go to hell. Days passed as he made various plans, grand schemes for the church. Thousands of people gathered around the village with torches and spears. "Come out, Richard. We'll skin you alive and kill you. I'll chew your raw flesh. Return my daughter, my son." "Everyone, calm down. Richard of the Virginia tribe. If you come out now, we'll give you the least painful death possible. Return the children immediately and apologize before the graves of our ancestors. Those who follow him, come out. You have been deceived by the threats and deception of that dishonorable person. So if you come out now, we will at least spare your—" Bang! 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 3 gunshots Richard fired into the air were all the answer. And he quietly said to his followers around him, "If you go out now, I swear in the Lord's name that I will shoot you in the back. Then you would go to hell. You died having abandoned your faith. And even after hearing my words, you chose death. Isn't that suicide? Choose. Now." With fear in everyone's eyes, Richard smiled with satisfaction. Yes, good. And thus days passed. Food ran out. They endured water shortages by catching and drinking rainwater that fell several times. More days passed. While Richard nodded off, a few people ran away. The atmosphere in the village became gloomy. After that day, Richard didn't sleep. As time passed, even enemies who had feared the gun gradually tightened their encirclement. When Richard dozed off slightly, in his dream, he saw his followers skinning him alive and offering it to the enemies. Then he woke up in fear, trembling, and gave a speech to his followers about how betraying him now was betraying the Lord, and only death awaited those who did so. More days passed. Several villagers collapsed from hunger. Richard saw visions in his drowsiness and hunger. On one side was the Valley of Death, and on the other were stairs leading to the Hall of Heaven, and the Confederation warriors surrounding him. The merchants who had abandoned him, and the followers who had betrayed him were falling into the valley, up the very narrow stairs to heaven. Only he and the people he led were happily walking up, and all of humanity, except for the people he led, were falling into hell. Richard, looking down at this scene with satisfaction, at some point, "Gigi, get up! Get up!" He wakes from his vision as someone shakes his shoulder. Urgently picking up his gun and staggering to his feet, Richard glares at the follower who just called him and says, "Explain why you woke me." "Take the siege. The siege is being lifted." "What?" As Richard urgently looked beyond the palisade of the village, thousands of men who had surrounded the village in a circle were indeed noisily clearing a path on one side. Someone was walking through that gap. A very tall man with an appearance that seemed both Eastern and native. Richard could tell who he was. He could tell who he was. Richard unknowingly shouted with joy and ran out. "Why, you who have no name, you who are no one before the Lord. Praise him. He comes to me as if a king is rescuing his subject. He, like Alexander who made the kings of the world kneel with majestic strides. Angel! He is arriving at the entrance of the village." Richard unknowingly knelt and prostrated himself before his feet. It was because his strength gave out. He trembled and laughed like a madman. Ah! I've been waiting only for this moment. Only for this moment. Behold, this glory. My followers, look. He has personally come to congratulate and commend me. You worshippers of Satan, you look too. The just ruler of the community and the head of the Holy Church is like this to me. Lift your head. Ah, yes, yes. I will lift it. I will lift. Now. The voice is cold. It feels ominous somehow, but it's just a trivial concern. Richard lifts his head. His face is cold, as if carved from the ice that has accumulated for thousands of years on that mountain range. Richard lost his words in a moment of embarrassment, and the Nameless One said, "How are you walking on the path of destruction?" Chapter 224. Essence 1. For a moment my mind goes blank. For a moment, my smiling face freezes. And after thinking for a moment about what the Nameless One had said to me, "What do you mean?" I realize it. Ha ha ha, ha, ha. A bitter laugh escapes briefly, but his face remained coldly hardened, unchanging. I dare to ask again. What? What do you mean by that? Then he turns around. He looks at those soldiers who made way for him and speaks. I told them I would punish you and entered this place. The meaning of those words was clear. So clear that at that moment, the smile lingering on Richard's lips shattered and his eyes wavered. What? What are you saying? What do you? Richard's hands tremble violently, unknowingly biting his lower lip so hard it bleeds. He says, "What do you mean?" Startled by his outcry, his followers gather around. Regardless of their whispering, he spoke. Did I kill anyone? No. Did I steal? That's not the case either. I have not violated a single line of the commandments, and the Lord knows that. I worshipped the one God, kept the Sabbath holy, honored my parents, stayed away from falsehood, and did not covet another's wife or possessions. Richard's fists clench. In this unexpected situation, he felt no other emotion. What did I do wrong? Perplexity. I destroyed idols, because the Holy Scriptures commanded to do so. I spread the gospel, because the Holy Scriptures commanded to do so. I baptized, I took in the poor, Yes, I did all that. What was wrong with any of it? I purified their so-called sanctuary, and erected a cross just as the Lord purified the temple. Isn't this following the example shown to us by the Lord? I commanded them to abandon everything and follow only the Lord just as the Lord did to his disciples. Isn't this bestowing the greatest teaching a Christian can offer? I acted according to the Lord's will. Without even breathing, he shouted, panting. Despite drowsiness pouring in and hunger attacking. What had he been enduring for until now? Why have I acted this way? Isn't it all because I acted according to the Lord's will? He shouted unceasingly like that. He wailed. He cried, screamed, and made a scene, prostrating himself before him. He cried like a baby whose toy had been taken away. And he remained silent. He didn't say anything, just waiting for Richard to collapse from exhaustion on his own. He only added one more word. Really? Pardon. At those words, Richard trembled all over and glared with his eyes. When he glared at the Nameless One, the anger in his eyes melted for a moment. Do you truly know the Lord's will? And he closes his mouth briefly at his words. How do you know? You said with your own mouth that you have never violated the commandments. Speaking thus, the Nameless One looks around behind Richard. Richard unconsciously turns his head to follow his gaze. There should have been his followers there, filled only with reverence toward the Lord, only devotion toward the Lord. Huh? Strange. Faith couldn't be found in their eyes. They were merely afraid of Richard himself. Of me? But now I see that you have violated the commandments. The Lord said love one another, but you taught them hatred and fear. That was hatred toward evil, not hatred toward family, friends, neighbors. That was, even the Lord commanded to. Richard unconsciously fell silent. Excuses ceaselessly swirled in his mind. Numerous sentences were assembled and scattered repeatedly. But his mouth wouldn't open. His mouth wouldn't open. The nameless one slowly bent down. Thus, he matched eye level with Richard, who was kneeling in silence. He wiped Richard's tears with his finger. They asked me to send you away from this land. So let's go. Let's leave this place. Saying this, he stood up and spoke to the others, to Richard's followers. All of you now, return to your families and neighbors. I apologize for the many discourtesies during this time. And so they dispersed. Only the two of them remained in the village, and thousands of warriors still surrounded them like a sea around an island beyond there. As Richard fearfully backed away, he grabbed his shoulder. Don't be afraid. I will be by your side. At those words, Richard closed his eyes for a moment, and then opened them. Yet he was still afraid. Thousands of people were glaring at him. Still, he walks into them. Shouting sounds are heard from behind. Looking back, he saw the chief who had lost his daughter to him, hugging his half-starved daughter and crying out, "You damned bastard! You, talking about eternal punishment and whatnot, making people half-dead. Terrible person. Cursed fellow. Have I really done such wrong? Is it such a great wrong to try to act according to the scriptures?" Resentment and shame intertwined complexly, making his body tremble. Even without that, the hatred and anger that hundreds and thousands of people poured onto that one was itself difficult to withstand. No one directly threatened him. Though they spat at his feet, cursed and pointed fingers, they did not attack him. Because he was watching just a few steps behind him. Because the Mohawk knew that his power was several times stronger and richer than their own. Nevertheless, it was unbearable. Not just the hatred and contempt of those who could simply forget and move on, but the fact that his efforts had come to nothing was so bitter and painful. Coming to this land, working so hard, until his body was worn out. But if the result is this hatred and anger and resentment, where did I go wrong and what? Perhaps all of me is wrong. This bastard is worse than a dog. Turning around at someone's shout. A large stone and a clump of mud come flying. Whether judging by the act of shouting loudly before throwing, or by the angle and speed of the throw, it seemed they didn't actually want to hit him. Nevertheless, Richard didn't try to avoid it. He had no will to do so. He just closed his eyes. And thud. Chapter 225. Essence. 2. When he opened his eyes again, silence filled the surroundings. He, who had been following a few steps behind him until just now, was right beside him. Covered in filthy mud, bleeding from his head. Are you all right? That's what I should be asking you. As he stood dazed, someone who had just thrown the stone and mud rushed forward and prostrated before him. No, it was closer to being pushed out by his tribesmen. Sorry. Great Chief, I didn't know, he said, trembling with fear. Are you okay, Richard? Pardon. Let's go, he answered calmly. They walked. This time, no one said anything. The Mohawk kept the path open, and ridiculously, they only looked at him, who was covered in mud, with eyes full of reverence. Someone among them asked, "Why does such a noble one do that for a sinner?" Then he slowly turned his head to look at him. Because he will repent. Pardon. Shouldn't everyone have an opportunity to repent and learn? This time, true silence returned. That is the teaching we believe in and follow. If you're curious, please come visit. We will always welcome you as guests. So he spoke with a smile. And thus, they returned. Equals. Richard gazed blankly at the St. Lawrence River, where the ice had completely melted, trying to soothe his sore heart. Of course, it didn't work well. Every scene viewed from the deck of the ship was terribly painful. When that river was covered in ice, Richard was full of enthusiasm. He felt like he could do anything. Under the support of the community, it seemed he could reveal the glory of the Lord and enlighten those barbarians. But what was the result? The believers he had gathered through intimidation soon all abandoned their faith and returned to their original way of life. The sanctuaries and idols he had destroyed and damaged with self-righteousness were restored. Far from building a new church, he was being led back by his hand like a child who had caused an accident. He had accomplished nothing. Perhaps he would never return here again. With a gloomy heart, as he watched the sun setting over the river, he heard someone approaching from the distance. He trembled and turned around. And there he stood, the one he had been thinking of. Is it difficult? No. You don't need to strain yourself with lies. Why are you wasting time here alone? Not even coming at mealtime? Richard spoke with his head bowed deeply. I was ashamed. Of what? Naturally, of what I've done. His eyes reddened as he reflected on the years he had spent in the Mohawk lands. Didn't do anything. I achieved nothing properly. How is it not terrible that I, this person, have only brought harm to the community? I just want to die. If I had just a little less faith, I might have just drowned in that sea. Don't think like that. Despite his words, Richard quietly kept his head bowed and looked down at the quietly flowing river. There had never been a time when he felt such helplessness. It was as if he had fallen into a tank filled with liquids of helplessness and depression. It felt like helplessness and depression were rising to the tip of his uvula, about to suffocate him. I will now lay down my office. It's not because I didn't achieve anything. That alone wouldn't have made me this ashamed. Richard's hands trembled. With trembling hands, he wiped his face. I still don't understand what I did wrong. The river breeze feels cold even though it's early summer. Is it because the weather is cold? Or, I acted exactly as the Bible states. I taught people to live according to the Lord's will, and I told people exactly what was written in the scriptures. Of course, I was arrogant. I thought of them as barbarians and saw them as people below me. That is one of my great mistakes. But I felt that clearly wasn't all of it. Yet, I still don't know what my other mistakes were. I still don't know what made me fail, nor what my sins were. That is my greatest mistake. Therefore, I will now lay down this office, whether called a priest or a pastor. There's no need to go that far. At those words, Richard unconsciously lifted his head to look up at him again. The Nameless One, Shepherd of the Holy Church. If there's something you don't know, learn. If there's something you've done wrong, repent. He was looking at him with the warmest gaze possible. None of the mistakes you committed were irreversibly fatal. Fortunately, that was the case. So you should be grateful for your luck. At his words, Richard unknowingly melted and slid down onto the railing. He barely regained his balance and grabbed a nearby oak barrel, sitting on it with difficulty. Then he bent down to match his eye level and said, Let me ask you, whom do you serve? Pardon. For whom are you risking your life on this voyage, coming all the way to this distant north, and talking about spreading the gospel to complete strangers? Isn't this an obvious question? Even a 5-year-old child could answer such an easy question. Oh, of course, it's the Lord who is the way, the truth, and the life. That's right. Then He is your way. And a way is something to be followed. One obvious statement follows another in a chain. It feels like listening to content saying 1 + 1 = 2, and adding 1 more = 3. Lost in such thoughts, Richard absent-mindedly stared at his face and, Then did you follow that way? Pardon. He was left speechless at his words. For a moment, even the sound of waves seemed to quiet down. Richard saw his face in that stillness. That calm, composed face gave him an inexplicable sense of relief. It seems I didn't. In that relief, he could speak honestly. For him, eternal life was a carrot for believers, and eternal punishment was a whip for believers. And like a madman, he wielded that whip and threw that carrot at believers. In the end, he was a horse trainer, not a pastor leading believers. It seems I didn't. His eyes reddened. Then he pats Richard's shoulder and speaks again. You said you serve love itself, but you didn't act that way. Then how could people believe in you and your God? Perhaps that's why people hated you so much. Because you hated them first. Because you tried to teach them hatred, fear, and greed instead of sharing love together. As Richard shook his head, the sound of waves gently tapped the side of the ship. Richard spoke with a sense of shame. I still don't quite understand. Somewhat clear but also unclear. Can someone like me still hold a clerical position? It's okay. He smiles, and Richard felt comfort in that. Next time you can do better. Go back and pay for your sins. Next time. At those words, Richard felt his hands, no, his whole body trembling again, and he slid off the oak barrel to sink to the floor. Felt as if the ship's floor, no, the entire river was vibrating. It felt as if some great tremor was shaking the whole world and his body, not just his body trembling. Then did you follow that way? The followers driven by one who whips them to believe in God eventually scattered, but people might follow one who walks the same path as God. Like someone who takes stones and mud for a sinner, forgives them, and makes them repent. Unable to hold back anymore, he cried. He cried and clung to his feet. He remained still even as his pants became soaked with tears. Just remained still. A seabird cried from afar. Chapter 226. Ritual Debate 1. Sigh. I couldn't help but sigh at the thought that I had barely managed to calm things down before the problem grew larger. We almost had a war on our hands. If we had gotten involved in a fight entangled in long-standing tribal grudges on the opposite side of the continent, there would truly be no end to it. It's not that I'm afraid of losing. What's frightening is the resentment that won't fade until one of the two sides disappears. Anyway, if the problem had escalated and someone from our community had been killed by another tribe for the first time, I too would have been unstoppable. Expelled while doing missionary work? What about making a protest? I question whether it's really okay to let this go. Our missionary didn't harm anyone. Anyway, that's enough. I too deeply feel the responsibility. I will gladly accept whatever punishment the council decides. So please stop. Missionary Richard, who had caused the problem, came to the council in person to dispel the controversy. If a stranger took your family members away by frightening them for reasons you never imagined, would you accept it willingly? Let's not discuss this issue further. Let's give Richard Peterson an appropriate punishment for the purpose of rehabilitation, and give him a chance to restore his clerical position after he has served his punishment. Now let's vote. I firmly established that it was our fault to prevent unnecessary conflict. And this isn't just any issue. It's about missionary work. It's a matter that Christians believe to be the most noble act. If we're not careful, we could touch on a religiously hot potato, so it was right to handle it definitively like this rather than addressing it ambiguously. It was our fault. The missionary we sent committed rudeness and atrocities against them, so it's right for us to apologize and resolve the issue on our side. Because I strongly advocated for apology and responsibility, most council members also accepted my opinion and overwhelmingly outvoted the opposition. Most council members are also natives who haven't been Christians for long. After resolving the issue, what needed to be done was clear. Guns, iron axes, cats, various jewels, glass ornaments, and so on. I loaded up on all the trade goods that natives typically prefer and boarded the ship again. I have to take responsibility since we made a mistake. After a month or two, I was able to reach the land of the Mohawk again. Actually, I wasn't sure if I would be allowed to enter their territory, since Richard had apparently been causing trouble across quite a wide area. May we enter your territory for peaceful purposes? Gee, good heavens. The Virginia tribe has returned. Ah, no, please come in. Thank you. The atmosphere was somehow strange. No one stopped us. Warriors made way for us, and people opened doors when we tried to enter. But once we actually entered the village... Nemo? Yes, Vicente. Speak. It feels like a tomb. I want to leave immediately. The atmosphere was suffocating. There was no one hostile to us. They just glanced at us, and if they were about to make eye contact, they would quickly avert their gaze and make way. No one threatened us. If we approached to say something, everyone would slowly back away. When we handed over our apologies and gifts, they would snatch them, mumble words of thanks, and step aside. Even the chiefs of each village seemed anxious, looking around, with an obvious desire to send me away. This village we entered now was the same. It was where Richard had been most active. As we passed the palisade and entered the village, the roads were empty without a single person, just as deserted. Meanwhile, we could feel gazes, probably from people watching us from inside their homes. Yet, strangely busy sounds could be heard from various places. We walked through this atmosphere, as if ghosts were moving about, toward a large house in the center of the village. There, a wrinkled old man extinguished his tobacco and gestured toward us. "I heard news that you would come. Welcome. You." He didn't seem welcoming at all. Not long after we started talking, the chief rose from his seat, coughing, and moved away, followed by his attendants and those who appeared to be shamans, all getting up and retreating together. It seems they've emptied this house for us to use as our lodging. Of course, it seemed more like they were fleeing, but we decided to accept it that way. It was puzzling no matter how much I thought about it. Last time, they weren't this cautious. It seemed excessive to be this wary just because Richard had caused trouble. If that were the case, they would have shown hostility toward us. Why on earth are they acting like this? Anyway, as we spread out our sleeping bags, lit fires, and prepared meals in various places, Rustle. Curious children glanced at us from a distance nearby. They seemed curious after seeing our strange attire and hearing our foreign language. When I gently offered the grapes I was holding, the children hesitated for a moment before approaching me. The hesitant children began to converse among themselves in small, quick voices. "Dad said not to meet these people. It's almost time for the ritual, and who knows what will happen. We just need to take this, eat it, and leave. What's the problem?" "But," Dad said, "these people will prevent us from holding our ritual." "What?" "Children." When I opened my mouth, the children were startled and turned their attention to me. What would they hear? Probably a strange foreigner speaking their language perfectly. "What are you talking about?" "A ritual." But as soon as I asked, the children fled in fear without even taking the grapes I had offered. What happened? Nothing. It's nothing. I shook my head at Vicente's question and turned over thoughts in my mind. Wait. Thinking about it again, even when we surrounded Richard last time, it was strange. According to the catalog, the number of warriors in the Iroquois Confederation, including the Mohawk tribe, doesn't easily exceed tens of thousands. But they called thousands of warriors to besiege just dozens of people? And they only surrounded them without directly attacking until I arrived? Vicente, how does their attitude seem to you? Extremely rude. Not that. How was the look in their eyes when they saw us? They were afraid. That could be. But these people must have already met Europeans. Are they afraid of us just because we're outsiders? That can't be all. When I asked this to Vicente, he shrugged and said, "That's because they know we're much stronger than they are, don't they? If we were to fight them, they would certainly lose. So they're avoiding a fight." That too. Could be. But somehow I felt like that wasn't the whole story. When night fell and the group had gone to sleep, I still couldn't shake off that uneasy feeling and went out for a walk. The village was completely quiet, as were the empty spaces nearby. And when I looked around the area, something that looked like it had been burned and left behind. Upon closer inspection, it was a familiar shape. A signpost. Maybe, "Do not make idols." Reading the words, I could tell who had erected it. Digging underneath, I found some wooden figures. Idols that had been broken, half-burned, and scorched. It seemed Richard had destroyed and burned pagan idols here. I unknowingly pressed my forehead. Why would he do such a thing? Huh? Wait a moment. Chapter 227. Ritual Debate 2. These people will prevent us from holding our ritual. That's because they know we're much stronger than they are. Don't they? I turned on my phone for a moment and checked today's date. December 19th, 1608. It was almost the winter solstice. Fortunately, they left a few days ago. It's a blessing they came right before the holy day. How could we not call this impure? Everyone nodded as the chief spoke. Their faces were filled with relief, and their bodies trembled with anticipation. Burning incense that elevated mood and lighting fires, they drove away the night's cold and darkness. This winter was not as murderous as the last, so more people had gathered. They gathered for the sacred game. Holding peach pits blackened on one side, they threw them at each other, keeping score and predicting good or bad harvests. They remembered the last ritual. A rioter carrying a cross had come in, destroyed everything, and left, saying everything except the one spirit he served was an evil spirit. However, they couldn't stop him, because they knew what was behind him. Here 1 point, 2 points over here. They shouted exaggeratedly and sang songs, trying to shake off the gloomy memories of the past year. They feasted noisily and prayed for a bountiful harvest next year. And suddenly, the sound of footsteps made everyone's laughter die down. Everyone turned their gaze from inside the hut to the outside. They saw a long shadow. They saw him. I apologize for coming as an uninvited guest. He was quiet, calm, also courteous. He spoke the clan's language fluently, making everyone tense. And I now understand what you all fear. With those words, he intervened in the midst of the ritual. He quietly sat opposite the chief and the shaman. You are an uninvited guest. The chief spoke with a trembling voice, but with dignity. The person you sent insulted our traditions. And you, swoosh. He looked around for a moment, then walked toward a wooden figure of some spirit. Everyone's faces turned pale, but they couldn't say anything. Yes, they couldn't do anything. Perhaps this is what would happen if they joined their so-called community. Having family members kidnapped before their eyes, having idols destroyed before their eyes, having shamans insulted before their eyes. Thus, their world would be denied. And Thud, placed flowers in front of the wooden figure. What this meant could be understood without any explanation. While they stood with their mouths open, unable to say anything, he turned his head and said, I've come to pay respect to your ceremony. Would you grant me the honor? Everyone remained silent and simply looked at the chief. Then the chief seemed to think deeply about something. He held out something. A peach pit burnt on one side. Would you like to throw this? And all night long, he and the villagers threw dice made of peach pits and counted scores. It seemed next year would be a bountiful harvest. An angel participated in a pagan ritual, offered flowers to an idol. Exactly as I said, I participated in their winter solstice ceremony and showed respect for their culture. Now they will no longer fear us. The Grand Council of the Iroquois Confederation has completed its deliberation and will soon join us. But breaking the commandment is, did I worship that idol? I simply bowed and placed flowers before it. The Lord will know where my heart is directed. The deed was already done and irreversible. I slowly spoke to those who were astonished. And what could I say to those whose faith was insulted and whose families were kidnapped by our missionary just recently? How empty would it sound to ask them to find true faith? To be honest, I didn't think of it as a big issue. Even in Japan, there are Christians who hold ancestral rites. Of course, it's not a simple matter. Traditional ceremonies and faith are honestly not areas that can be clearly separated. Even non-Christians look for Santa, but doesn't Santa originate from Saint Nicholas, a Catholic saint? Plus, Santa appears on Christmas, Jesus' birthday. Each of these issues can blur the identity of a religion and weaken its authority. And if the authority of our church weakens, my authority will also be shaken. Still, this is right. It's better for mission work if they welcome us as guests rather than trembling in fear when they see us. But whether viewed practically or morally, this is right. At least my values from 21st century modern society say so. Coincidentally, the famous Matteo Ricci is alive in China at this time. He spread Catholicism while allowing ancestral rites, producing numerous results. Conversely, when Catholicism suppressed ancestral rites, Catholics became objects of contempt and caution in China and Joseon, and dwindled away. No one would welcome those who belittle and try to destroy their traditions as devil worship. Thinking of a closer example made it simpler. Has anyone developed a favorable view of Christianity after seeing news about Christians cutting the heads off statues of historical figures, destroying village guardians, and burning down Buddhist temples? I doubt it. Eventually, if those Mohawk people become Christians, their rituals will just remain as fun traditional games and festivals. And if they don't convert, what can we do if they refuse conversion in the first place? Kill them as devil worshippers and drive them from their homeland? Suppress their faith and force them to bow before the cross? Kidnap and take away children to forcibly raise them as Christians? That's what happened in the original history. When Paul went to Athens in the Acts of the Apostles, although he was displeased seeing all the idols, he respected the citizens there. Did he destroy and insult their idols? He knew that if he suddenly destroyed and toppled those idols, people would be hostile to him. So he praised the citizens' religiosity and then slowly spoke about the coming of the Lord. And look at the mansions built in England by those who claim not to worship idols. Those places are filled with statues of ancient Greek and Roman gods. Why don't they destroy those? Aren't those for decoration, not for worship? Correct. Someday, if those Mohawk people convert, they will say the same. But that won't happen in my community. I don't know how many months, how many years have passed. Richard's sense of time dulled as he performed arduous tasks like paving roads, moving heavy rocks, and running around all day to collect lists from other citizens. When he realized his work was finished, he was already wearing priestly vestments again, with a Bible in hand. This time, instead of a ship, he rode a carriage across the Appalachian Mountains. He reached a land that in the distant future would be called Ohio. And when he reached his post, people saw him and smiled, extending their hands. Since the community trading post was already being established there, they weren't too hostile to outsiders. Welcome. May the spirits of this land welcome you. And, at those words, Richard momentarily stiffened. He looked at the person before him. That tattoo pattern, that attire. According to what he had learned, this person was the shaman of this land, the center of idol worship. Richard quietly closed his eyes, and then, "Thank you for your hospitality," he said with a bright smile, not as if meeting a devil worshipper, but as if meeting a new neighbor. Chapter 228, 20th Christmas. 1. The problem had been resolved. The conflict with the Iroquois was settled, and the victims were reassured that such incidents would not happen again. We also established principles that must be followed during future missionary work. Feeling that this was enough, I left immediately after their festival. It was appropriate to give them space, as having an outsider constantly present would make them anxious and uncomfortable. Of course, there was another reason. Very close to their festival day. Will we end up spending Christmas on the ship this year? You guys, where's my gift? None for you. Hanging up stockings won't do you any good. So go back and prepare gifts for your daughter. Because we had our own festival. Now it's Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1608. This is my 20th Christmas in this world. As soon as I stepped out of my cabin, rubbing my eyes at the sound of conversations outside the door, the entire place was in chaos. This much. Bright red stockings hung from every cabin door and hammock, and a red carpet was laid out along the corridor. Neatly rolled Christmas wreaths decorated the walls throughout. Oh wow. For people who used to just accept Christmas as a holiday and say things like, well, it's Jesus' birthday, so we should celebrate, they're being quite enthusiastic. Have they all adapted now? Hey, I told you to set up the tree properly. How many times has it fallen over now? Geez. Don't be so harsh. It's Christmas, isn't it? Then you should do better on Christmas Day. Thinking this, I went up to the deck, where people were still busily preparing for tomorrow. Red and white dyed cotton fluff and fabric decorations were scattered throughout the ship, and the sailors each wore antler decorations on their heads. They were headbands made with real deer antlers. And on their noses are those red beads? Anyway, as I walked onto the deck, Vicente, who had been giving various orders to the sailors, turned around, saw me, and shouted, "Merry Christmas! Isn't it still Christmas Eve? In just 15 minutes, it will be midnight. The Lord would forgive such a small error." Anyway, spending a proper Christmas on a ship, thanks to that missionary, we're having quite an unusual experience, right? It is a proper Christmas, from head to toe. Looking at Vicente Gonzalez in his red clothes from socks to hat, I couldn't help but think so. Did you, perhaps, order the sailors' Rudolph costumes? Yes, I did. Fortunately, everyone seems to like them. Presents, 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 presents. They do seem to be enjoying themselves. No, perhaps overly enthusiastic might be the right way to put it. Their festive spirit seemed to overflow beyond any reasonable measure, as if the confined space of our vessel demanded an inversely proportional expansion of holiday cheer to compensate. It felt like they were pouring all their efforts into enjoying Christmas 200 times more on this small ship, cramming every tradition and decoration into our limited quarters with an almost desperate determination. The crew members moved about with permanent grins, singing carols at all hours and distributing handmade gifts with zealous insistence. I'm not sure what drove this extraordinary display. Perhaps it was homesickness, or the need to create warmth in the midst of the vast, cold ocean. Anyway, the atmosphere was incredible, almost surreal in its intensity. On the tree, a real cut pine tree placed in the middle of the deck and secured against the rolling waves, oil lamps hung all around, casting dancing golden light across the wooden planks. Various ornaments sparkled between them, some clearly handcrafted from materials found aboard, others treasured keepsakes brought from distant homes. Glass baubles reflected the lamplight, multiplying its glow into countless tiny stars. The star placed at the very top, representing the Star of Bethlehem that rose with the birth of Jesus, was the only decoration that emitted its own light, brought from my home. There were also variations, such as belts woven from wampum, a sacred item valued by the natives, wrapped around the tree, or someone had drawn Santa riding a canoe instead of a sleigh on the ship's railing. More noticeable than anything else was, "Be careful moving those beads. Don't break them. Have all the beads been strung? Wait, I haven't finished stringing them all." Not native culture, nor European culture, but those truly random decorations. Thin strips of leather with small glass beads strung at intervals and hung in long strands. The sailors were happily wrapping these strands around the tree and throughout the ship. The beads on the strands sparkled blue or bright red in the moonlight and firelight. The origin of these unfamiliar decorations was surprisingly clear. When I first introduced 21st century Christmas customs to people, the first thing I showed them was the Christmas tree. It was the least likely to cause resistance and visually impressive. Taking out a dusty tree from home, assembling it, adding decorations, and then, click, turning on the lights, those sparkling LED lights from that time. Everyone, be careful not to break the LED beads and hurt yourselves. Yes, sir. Were imitated to create LED beads, non-illuminating, not diodes. Well, traditions are often born this way. I shrugged my shoulders and picked up a nearby Rudolph headband to try on. Mr. Nemo. Merry Christmas. Wow, it was terribly heavy. Equals. Christmas was being celebrated grandly on Croton Island as well. Ignition. Click. His entire mansion is lit up. He told the apostles to prepare everything before he left, I heard. No, it was much grander. Kin Issei's farm sparkled with genuine Christmas lights everywhere. and as the villagers prepared the feast while looking at the mesmerizing sight that resembled countless stars descending to earth. But this feast wasn't just for the people of Croton Island. It was none other than the Lord's birthday. Moreover, it was a monumental Christmas marking exactly 20 years since he came down to this land to save them. In a way, it was also like the 20th anniversary of the community, so people ran around busy and laughing joyfully in an irrepressible excitement. Almost every tree near the village was decorated with ornaments, candles, and lamps. Chapter 229, 20th Christmas. 2. Countless tables and chairs were set up in the center of the village, enough to seat hundreds of people. And then they waited. A ship is coming. This year they're arriving right on Christmas? What if they had been late? They said the weather was bad, so let's forgive them. For the guests coming to Croton, they were people who had made names for themselves by dedicating themselves to the community over the past year. A Welsh agricultural knight who had just been appointed but had plowed a record amount of fields, and an English priest who had been ordained less than 2 months after arriving in the community, stepped onto the island. Visiting the Holy Land for the first time, they shivered slightly and cautiously took their first steps onto the island, as if questioning whether they were worthy to tread upon this place. Their cautious attitude made the islanders and apostles tense as well. "Oh, Dad, there are lights on all the trees. Oh, Lord, is this really a place where people live? Those houses are all so interesting. I've never seen this style before, and the roof colors are really pretty." When they sat awkwardly at the tables to enjoy the feast, unable to close their mouths at the splendid sight of Croton. The seat at the head of the table was empty. Its owner was predetermined. Step. I've only heard about it. To actually set foot here. How is it, Your Majesty? It's fascinating. Everything is fascinating. And the Queen sat at his immediate right. There were no guests of higher status than her. Next to her sat the apostles, except for Vicente who wasn't present, and the island's residents and other guests sat at the other tables. The European guests awkwardly took their seats at the guidance of the hosts, most of whom were Americans. Feeling anxious, they opened the lids of the dishes on the table, wondering if unfamiliar food would appear. Ha! It's normal. A feast of chicken, venison, beef, and other meats was laid out. Although the food had a reddish tint overall, perhaps because the meat was slightly undercooked or of a different breed, it wasn't significantly different from European food. On the Lord's birthday, say your prayers and eat. This is a feast prepared for you by the one who is not present. At Raleigh's shout, the guests dazedly picked up the food. Watching the American hosts naturally eating, drinking, and chatting, they clumsily followed suit and put the food in their mouths. Everyone did. Elizabeth did too. "What's wrong, Your Majesty?" The Queen's eyes widened. Cold sweat ran down the back of her neck, and her hands trembled. The Queen almost spat out her food without realizing it. Decades of strictly maintained etiquette prevented a disaster. What is this? What did I pick up?" Elizabeth steadied her trembling gaze and urgently looked down at the food she had picked up. There was a seemingly normal chicken leg. It was nothing unusual, just slightly red. "Is it difficult to eat?" "It's because of the chili. Li. It adds a slightly spicy taste." "Slightly? Nemo likes it. The angel likes it." "Ah, Your Majesty, that dish is chicken rubbed with powder made from smoked and dried chili peppers. The locals all love its distinctive flavor." There was no chance to feel any distinctive flavor. There was something like hellfire, though. Anyway, even after Raleigh's explanation from the seat 2 places away, the Queen couldn't feel any distinctive taste or whatever. She only felt pain as if someone was beating her tongue to death. She couldn't even swallow it, because the moment she swallowed, she instinctively felt that her old and tired intestines would collectively go on strike, causing her to suffer for days. But it was also strange to just keep it in her mouth like this. "Your Majesty, are you finding it difficult to eat?" The Queen tried to answer Margaret that she was fine. "But you seem to be struggling a lot." "That's understandable. It must be an unfamiliar taste for your majesty. Wouldn't anyone react that way to an unfamiliar taste? Something about everyone's looks. It's uncomfortable. She didn't know that the dish she had just eaten was the result of Kin Issei trying to spread chili-based dishes by modifying Cajun chicken recipes. And when people first ate it and suffered, Kin Issei calmly ate it while subtly showing off his spice tolerance. Through that spicy training, the taste buds of the Croton people drifted somewhere between 21st century Japanese and Americans, becoming addicted to the stimulation. Ah, this one's having trouble eating too. Let's keep it to ourselves. What a shame. This delicious food. No, can eat. Ugh. And about the spice pride. Somehow, the Christmas feast that should have been warm seemed to be heating up in a different way. Elizabeth, sweating coldly, tried to figure out how to save face while only picking dishes without chili. Ah, even the Queen of England doesn't know. She turned her head at someone's voice. Even for a queen, it must be difficult. It was Oitoten. Chili-seasoned fried chicken is difficult for beginners. Feeling somehow angry, the queen swallowed the chicken in her mouth. For the entire day, it felt like her esophagus was burning. Anyway, by the next day, people learned to choose foods without chili, and there were fewer disasters. They exchanged gifts, sang songs, danced, and enjoyed themselves. Some performed plays, others brought out alcohol they had been saving and drank heavily. Some didn't care about any of that and just ate up the endless stream of exotic dishes. As time passed, Epiphany came, and around the time the queen fully recovered. A ship is coming. It arrived on time. Everyone paused and turned their heads. They seemed to know what ship it was. And after some time, dozens of people walked in and began to sit next to their families and friends. The empty seats at the banquet began to fill, and the atmosphere became lively again. And someone also sat at the head table. He spoke. "Am I too late?" Then Eleanor and Hewitt, who were next to him, said, "No. You arrived just in time. Here, start with this veal." And so ended the 20th Christmas holiday in Croton. Chapter 230. Tree of Liberty 1. The Christmas season, the biggest holiday in Christian culture, had ended. People returned to their daily lives as they cleared away Christmas decorations scattered everywhere. Not that daily life meant much. It was the agricultural off-season from January until spring arrived in earnest in March. Even in Europe, where capitalism was actively developing, the basic economy still revolved around agriculture, so our community had become equally relaxed. I went to find Oitoten, who served as the head of the agricultural knights, professional diplomat, and salesman. Together with the knights he assigned to me, I traveled around in a porter. Since January is starting and the weather will gradually improve, we've decided everyone should focus on land development during this period. Things will probably get busy in earnest around March or April. How much land has been distributed to each resident so far? Thanks to the increased number of knights and tractors, it's grown quite substantially. Now, at the very least. Since declaring that we would distribute 25 hectares per person, even crawling infants now owned land several times larger than my farm. Ugh, I feel somewhat deprived. Of course, in reality, hardly any of our 100,000 residents farm directly. Rumbling. Arg. The tractor stopped working while Mr. Nemo is here inspecting. Those technicians, how did they even do the maintenance? For the most part, the knights did the actual farming, while landowners just occasionally visited to check the crop conditions. In a way, the knights in our community served the same role as pioneering farmers in American history. Ambitious people who wanted to become wealthy went to the frontier to develop new land. They literally fed our community. This time, our fortress plans to increase the proportion of wheat significantly according to the landowners' demands. Other places will likely do the same. The demand for rye continues to decrease. So, naturally, planning the community's agriculture was also their responsibility. They would proceed after consulting with the landowners, of course. Upon arriving at a fortress in the western region, Someone who was introduced as a commander of some night order bowed respectfully to me before pointing to papers pinned to the wall and methodically explaining their plans. Although each fortress is reducing the proportion of rye and increasing wheat, in reality, since natives prefer corn and the demand for chili peppers is growing, the proportion of wheat cultivation will also decrease. Besides, now that fertilizer is being distributed in earnest, there's no reason to hesitate with corn farming. The reason for the decreasing demand for barley and rye within our community was simple. They didn't taste good. Although the fields weren't completely replanted since the crops were still used as animal feed and for export, people rarely ate anything but white bread now. It was similar to how Japanese, once they reached a certain level of comfort, wouldn't touch brown rice unless it was for health reasons. However, while reviewing the report, I noticed something strange and asked, "Didn't you just say you're reducing the proportion of rye and barley?" "Yes, that's correct." "Then why has the expected cultivation area increased?" "They say they're reducing the proportion, yet they're planting more. Isn't that strange?" At my question, the knights tilted their heads, then pointed to one side of the report I was holding and said, "Look at the total cultivation area." "How many square meters is this?" Maybe around 3 square meters? Increased by 30% compared to last year? As I opened my mouth after finishing the mental calculation, everyone in the room nodded with satisfied expressions. Damn, 30% in 1 year, how much has the cultivated area expanded? I think the amount of grain we'll ship to England will increase significantly this time. Not just significantly. I think the expected export volume is this much, converting to pounds, then to Ocello. So real estate is the best investment after all. What did you say? Nothing. I trembled with the sudden wave of emotion. Everyone looked at me strangely, but they moved on, reacting as if to say, "That must mean he's impressed by our achievements." Even if some office worker from Tokyo had been transported here with his apartment, he couldn't have done this. What could city slickers who don't know about fertilizer, can't build tractors, and don't know the difference between tractors and cars do? Those guys wouldn't have accomplished anything even if you'd thrown educational comic books at them. You need to major in history to be transported to the past and change history? Nonsense. A town of 100,000 people producing enough food for 500,000 with surplus. Agriculture is the future. Equals. Virginia's economy was supported by 3 main pillars. First were the massive gifts from across the northeastern North America, mainly furs. The vast wealth brought by numerous Native Americans entangled in the community's trade network from extensive territories brought overwhelming prosperity to Virginia. The second largest share came from grains like wheat and rye. Virginia's grains heading to Britain helped support hundreds of thousands of people, falling like sweet rain on England, which suffered from chronic food shortages. Although their added value was lower, they were the most stable sector building wealth for Virginia. Their proportion in the economy was gradually increasing. Finally, there were various luxury crops like fruits, luxury goods like wine, and resources from Kin Issei's home, such as aluminum. These consisted of products with the highest added value. Although they seemed to have the smallest proportion of the 3 in terms of volume, considering that a bunch of Shine Muscat and Black Sapphire grapes cost several pounds, their significance couldn't be underestimated. To summarize, Virginia, monopolizing the New World's fur trade, determining England's grain prices, and selling luxury goods that were all the rage everywhere, was probably one of the richest regions in the world right now. The community's residents each wore fur coats in winter and lounged like Roman nobles enjoying various fruits in summer. Accordingly, their attention turned toward luxury. The shopping complex selling luxury goods such as interior decorations and high-end clothing was always bustling. People practically lived there. Wait, why don't we just move near the shopping complex? Chapter 231. Tree of Liberty, 2. Slowly, the village structure began to reorganize. Changes occurred in the Chesapeake settlement, where a dozen or so villages of 300 to 500 people were scattered. Gradually, people flocked around the shopping complexes, and the village structures began to rearrange. Surprised by the sudden mass migration to certain areas, Qin Issei and the apostles established shopping complexes in other villages as well, but this only slightly eased the trend. This is how Virginia's first city with a population exceeding 10,000 was born. The shopping complexes also doubled or tripled in size, becoming increasingly vibrant. And then, I need to expand my business. Taran, a Welsh carpenter, gathered his family and spoke while looking at the pile of Ocello chips before him. With this much, I need to hire other carpenters and train new assistants. If we keep working just among ourselves with only one workshop, we'll wear ourselves out. All the other family members agreed. They could have said it didn't matter if they quit the business if it was too hard. But no one suggested that. The table they were gathered around was mahogany imported from Asia. The carpet under their feet was said to be from Persia. They were drinking black tea imported from China. They couldn't give up this lifestyle. Let's try living in a palace-like house for once. Let's live luxuriously. That's what I'm saying. I don't want to nitpick, but a palace-like house seems difficult. There's no one to clean it. If we pay a higher price for someone, who would come? It's not like people are struggling to make a living. Is that so? What a strange situation. Anyway, our family's goal is to expand the business. Taran, while tilting his head, declared this. After the family meeting, he posted job listings on the bulletin board in the middle of the shopping district a few days later and spread the word through his network that he was looking for people. He also went to the Chesapeake Port Shopping Complex Management Group to ask if he could expand his workshop and prepared to move. He imported tools from England and France for the new hires to use. And no one applied for months. That's strange. As far as I know, there are plenty of carpenters in this area. Why aren't they coming? Moreover, he couldn't find apprentices either, despite offering wages several times higher than what he paid in Wales. We're in the same situation. It's ridiculous, isn't it? They say young people these days have become so lazy that they don't want to do any substantial work. Taran, feeling puzzled, talked with the florist next door, but the situation was the same. Me? Work together? Under you? Then I'll have to decline. Well, I'm not sure. I'm already busy volunteering to build the cathedral. I'm currently working on the new synagogue the community is building. When he contacted his former carpenter colleagues, they all either claimed to be busy with public projects or openly avoided working under him. Well, I wouldn't mind if we were business partners, but working under you is a bit. I'll pay you well. Who works for money these days? If not for money, then what does one work for? As soon as he thought that, his friend's hand caught his eye. On what should be an ordinary carpenter's fingers hung numerous gold ornaments. Ah, that's right. Who would work for money these days? Money comes in even if they do nothing. Equals. The ancient sages said that agriculture is the great foundation of the world and commerce is a lesser occupation. Honoring the spirit of my ancestors, come to think of it, I don't need to honor their souls. It's the Edo period now. I first surveyed the agricultural knight's business status. Only then did I turn my attention to the trading company run by Raleigh. With multi-level marketing, agriculture, and various industries all growing, the trading company must be recording tremendous profits. Exports must be 2 or 3 times imports. Sigh, it's profitable, but it doesn't feel profitable. Pardon. With this much production, when I calculate the balance of trade with Great Britain, we only have this much left. Only this much? Yes, it improves when we include trade with France, but not dramatically. That's unexpected? After finishing my conversation with Raleigh, I realized something unusual was happening. What? Our exports? Furs? Wheat? Rye? Barley? Grapes? Wine? Aluminum, etc. Exports from Britain and France. Thread? Fabric? Paper, etc. We export agricultural products and luxury goods, while depending almost entirely on imports for industrially produced items. What is this developing country-like trade structure? Strange? We're clearly well off, so why is our economic structure like this? Suddenly feeling anxious, I visited the shopping complex area for the first time in a while, where shop owners grabbed my arms, imploring me to help them find employees. You said there are no carpenters to work? But I clearly saw carpenters volunteering at the cathedral construction site and public building projects. We almost had to cancel our workshop expansion. There's no one willing to be employed, so we barely managed to find a few partners, and the only ones willing to learn are our own children. What's going on? Then what about all those carpenters enthusiastically building the cathedral? Moreover, they work almost without pay. Above all, why didn't I know about this? Could it be? There are no people. I've been a stonemason for 20 years, and I've never seen such difficulty finding workers. Stonemasons? The public projects are always filled with volunteers. My original work? I was a papermaker, but now there's no one to work with. I'm just living. No one to work with? Among tens of thousands of Europeans, you're saying there's no other papermaker besides you? Upon investigation, apart from food and beverage industries with overwhelming demand like beer or whiskey, and the shipbuilding industry that we directly fostered, there weren't any factory-like operations running at scale. I heard you could make a fortune as a carpenter. Do you really need to do this? By dedicating myself to building this cathedral, I can get closer to heaven and leave my name behind. Where else could I find such glory? The names of those who contributed to building this road are engraved here in a row. Being able to dedicate oneself to the community is a great honor. People aren't earning money. I should have brought Mankiw's economics book from home. Chapter 232. Tree of Liberty. 3. The most precious liquid in the world is blood. Sustains life within life, moves life, and literally makes one living. That fishy, sticky liquid symbolizes life itself. Shedding blood means exposing life to the outside, taking a step closer to death. On the other hand, blood was often used as a sacrifice for great things because of its preciousness. Among these, human blood was considered not just precious but sacred, treated like a jewel among stones. In the Bible and the Quran, Abraham, the father of faith, was willing to offer his young son Isaac for God. That proved his devotion. According to Christian belief, the most exalted being in the world also sent his son, who was both perfect God and perfect human, to shed his blood. All this to save humanity. Blood was that precious and valuable. But sometimes it's considered more worthless than dirty water. Many people were trembling. The priest opened his mouth to calm them down. Stay calm. Everyone, remember the word. Their oppression cannot last long. But the lives of the righteous will continue forever. So if you engrave this in your hearts. Bang! A body collapsed with the gunshot. The master stood on the priest's body, who was gasping from the gunshot wound, and said, "This is near Santa Lucia, so soldiers will arrive soon. If you stay still, you might live. If any of you move wrongly, it's treason. Do you understand? I've already reported your devil worship to the authorities. Do you know any devil worshippers who impersonate priests or bishops?" A thrill of joy settled in the master's eyes. Along with it was the unique madness of those who had come all the way to remote places like Florida, desperately trying to fulfill their desires and dominate others. The master spoke again. "You just need to tell the truth to the soldiers. Then you can return under my protection." The priest squirmed and opened his mouth. He seemed to want to say something. He said, "That's a lie." Bang! With another bullet lodged in his head, the priest fell silent. Some people screamed, others cowered. The gun-wielding master and his cousins whispered among themselves. Smiles played on their lips. Should we have some fun before the authorities arrive? Who would complain if we killed a few slaves? Brother, let's not. If we provoke them too much, what could those things possibly do? Rather, they need an example to be like docile sheep. They deliberately whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. They filled their base satisfaction by watching a child wet himself in fear, by seeing someone shudder at the terrible sensation of their eyes roaming over their body. It seemed quite pleasing to them that there were people trembling at their feet, people begging for their lives. precious blood was flowing into the mud beneath the master's feet. They stood there, trampling the most precious thing in the world. They were stepping on someone's lifeblood. The slaves, horrified by this sight, frantically knelt down and cried out. They had no choice but to speak submissively before the master who had just killed their priest. Devil worship? We were just trying to study the gospel among ourselves. I don't know. I don't know anyone except the priest who just collapsed. I don't know anything about priests or bishops. I just attended a prayer meeting. Bang, bang, bang. After several warning shots, screams, cowering, trembling, and fear dominated the space. Everyone curled up in terror at the sound of bullets being fired. The master fired his gun wildly, as if intoxicated. He seemed drunk on the fact that with each twitch of his finger, someone's life could be decided. He fired at the ceiling and walls a few times, then his hand slipped carelessly. Bang! Someone accidentally, insignificantly, was shot and collapsed. As the scent of blood spread around again, the master realized. Perhaps it really wouldn't matter if he killed a few of these things right now. A murderous intent flickered in his eyes. They were the eyes of a killer drunk on violence. No, they were the eyes of a child breaking toys. He didn't see the things in front of him as people. Everyone thought about the approaching Spanish troops. Considering that this place wasn't far from Santa Lucia and that Spanish soldiers were coming to deal with the slaves' rebellion. Resistance meant certain death. They chose uncertain survival over certain death. They squeezed their eyes shut, hoping only that bullets wouldn't pierce their bodies. And then, thud. Huh? The master exhaled his final breath and collapsed, with the back of his head split in half. His cousins turned around in disbelief, and they saw a slave holding an axe that had been sharply ground, his body trembling. It was the one they had sent out to chop wood earlier. He was also the brother of that priest. His blood-covered hands. At that moment, the cousins realized they had crossed a line. Far beyond it. As they reloaded their guns and turned around, the slaves who had been acting like docile sheep until moments ago rushed at them like madmen. Bang, bang, bang. Silence. Equals. My knowledge of economics? Don't you need to study mathematics for economics? Mathematics was what I hated most during my school days. I can't even properly remember how to do calculus now. It's been a long time since I completed my mandatory education. Since then, my math skills seem to have steadily regressed to before middle school level. Economics, for me? That's nonsense. I can't do such things. Large-scale factories, yes, they're practically non-existent. There are a few sizable whiskey distilleries, but why should I work under someone else when I have my own land? Now that I can finally live freely. But it seems like I have to. Cold sweat streams down. Countless examples of developing country economic structures flood my mind without me realizing it. Well, they don't have to be called developing countries. Isn't this structure seen anywhere with abundant resources and small populations, like Northern Europe or the Middle East? But this is America. This is America far larger than Europe. America, where hundreds of thousands to millions of Europeans will flow in and settle down in the future. America, where tens to hundreds of thousands of natives still live. Our community which will absorb that land and population. It cannot be compared to countries with small populations and abundant resources. Sai, what should I do? Why is my community running this way? Well, I do know the reason. Distributing land to all new settlers? That makes sense. That's how it was done in the original history too. But there's one big difference between original history and us. There was no agricultural night order in the original history. So they just distributed undeveloped land and sent people out to pioneer on their own. Isn't that what the early American pioneer farmers were? But we do everything from start to finish. Pioneering, sowing, harvesting, exporting, everything. In other words, everyone in our community is practically a landed aristocrat. They wouldn't want to work under others. Chapter 233, Tree of Liberty, 4. So they actively participate in public projects or various religious events that offer even a little honor, trying somehow to elevate their names and do things that can earn respect in the community. They want to do only those things. Oh no, oh. What about our community's economy? What should we do in the future? If the population grows to hundreds of thousands and remains in this state, it will be really problematic. Anyway, today was the day for the regular assembly meeting. I thought I should mention this issue during the opening remarks they asked me to give. I stayed up all night preparing a simple speech. The content was brief, but it contained all the economic common sense that an average Japanese citizen would know, gathered from my limited economic knowledge. I looked over the speech content, made final edits, then walked to the assembly building for the meeting. When the main gate opened, it was already bustling inside. The speaker position rotated among the council members, so Eleanor sat in the speaker's seat, with other apostles sitting on either side. Eleanor? Walter's seat is empty. Ah, Sir Raleigh said he'd be a little late. He received a sudden summons from Her Majesty the Queen. The Queen must know today is the regular assembly meeting day. Something seems strange. Anyway, Raleigh's seat remained empty until almost all members had entered. People's gazes shifted from Raleigh's empty seat to Eleanor and me. Eleanor cleared her throat and declared the opening of the session. Then I stood up from my seat to distribute the documents I had prepared for my speech. Thud. Ah, I'm not too late. That was close. Walter. Ah, Mr. Nemo. It was Walter Raleigh who urgently opened the door and entered. He walked with eyes that seemed more unstable than usual. Not to his seat, but straight toward me. Walter, and he bent down and whispered in my ear. Florida has. It has happened. I froze momentarily at his words. A mixture of murmurs and strange silence swirled among the members. They all became agitated seeing my hardened face, but I couldn't easily soften my expression. I put down the documents I was holding, the materials prepared all day by someone ignorant of economics, searching through what little educational comics I had, but they weren't important. None of it was important at this moment. After fumbling awkwardly for a moment due to tension, I opened my mouth with difficulty. Everyone, please stand. The members all stood up, puzzled. The other apostles bowed their heads and asked Raleigh. Baron? What's happening? Did you hear something from the Queen of England? Come to think of it, she called for you even though today is the meeting day. Was there something? Dismissing all the commotion, I said, let us pray. Hiding the trembling of my hands, I clasped them together and applied pressure. For our brothers and sisters in Florida. For their lives, for their peace, and for their. Good heavens. I felt a chill running down my spine. Equals. There were two main reasons why Spain's colonies initially formed the infamous quasi-manorial encomienda system. First, there were already vast numbers of indigenous people living in Spanish Central and South America and Mexico. Second, more fundamentally, the conquistadors who formed the Spanish colonies wanted to secure their own domains and become nobles. The ambition to become nobility, the desire to secure one's own domain and subjects, to act as a small monarch within it. It was natural to have such ambitions in Spain, where blood nobles flourished, the bourgeoisie couldn't gain power, and local strongmen maintained powerful influence. And such ambitions inflated endlessly in places where Spanish authorities had diminished control. The terrible massacres and unbelievable licentiousness recorded by missionaries in the Brazilian jungles of original history must have been due to this. And this place was no different. Spanish people were transplanted along with numerous African slaves under the ambitious plan to control Florida, to check Virginia in the north. But their numbers were only a few thousand at most. Even counting tens of thousands of slaves, it was far from enough. Outside cities like Santa Elena, Santa Lucia, and San Jose, it was a lawless zone with just a few scattered farms. In that lawless zone, the only law was violence, and what the law protected was the desire to dominate. The slaves here, who had lived in a world existing solely to satisfy someone's disgusting desire to dominate, knew well. There was no option to escape. The principle of the Spanish in Florida and their allied natives was stern and concise. Any African wandering without a master is killed, regardless of reason. Just like killing a stray dog. Because of this, a seemingly sparse but deadly surveillance network was created. Wherever you go, the moment you encounter a non-slave, death awaits. Moreover, horrific torture will follow to set an example. If you manage to escape to Santa Lucia, the most orderly place in southern Florida, at least a merciful hanging awaits. All this time, it was the master who guaranteed their status and held the power of life and death over them. That master had just died. Moreover, that master had just reported them for treason. So soldiers would arrive soon. Soldiers in armor, equipped with guns and steel swords, fully armed, would kill them. They looked at their master, crying. Their master with his head split open, the man who had been like a god to them until just a few minutes ago. Although they had suffered enough to die because of him, this terrible colony had made slaves unable to survive without depending on him. They cried, screaming madly at the approaching death. Half crazed, they brutally butchered the master's corpse. They trampled his face with their feet. They strangled his neck with their hands. They beat various parts with their fists. They committed violence they would never have dared while he was alive. In that violence, they briefly felt what it meant to be alive. And when 2 or 3 Spanish soldiers arrived, without realizing it, they grabbed all the household items and poured out that violence again. The Spanish soldiers, surprised by the corpses in the house, were slow to respond in the face of the unexpected collective resistance. More gunfire, the sound of knives and pitchforks clashing, screams, the sound of foaming at the mouth, and the last survivor was not Spanish. Those who survived realized, covered in blood, what they had just done. About 20 Africans had died, the Spanish master and his cousin had died, and a couple of Spanish soldiers had died. And they had survived. With the blood of all the dead on their hands. The blood of slaves, masters, and soldiers mixed together. They were now rebels. They had become those who would be followed by a fate of death wherever they went within the reach of the empire. There was no way for them to survive. Now they had to choose how to die. With blood all over their bodies, holding the weapons that the masters and Spanish soldiers had carried, they moved to another place. Gunshots rang out and flames rose there too. The flames spread more and more. They wandered covered in blood. They kept wandering. Blood is the most precious liquid in the world. Human blood is the most sacred among them. A treasure sufficient to be offered as a sacrifice for something great. They threw the most precious treasure in the world onto the altar without reservation. Not just that of their masters whom they hated so much, but also their own. They no longer particularly wanted to live. After all, their previous life was not a life at all. Chapter 234. Tree of Liberty. 5. The regular meeting was quickly adjourned. As I left the assembly hall, Raleigh immediately followed me and said, "Her Majesty the Queen told me that when Englishmen were sailing along the Florida coast, many cities were burning or their ports were paralyzed. That's not all. The routes our secret society used to free slaves have been cut off one by one. From what I hear, this doesn't sound like good news. It might not be. It might not be." Saying this, Raleigh took out a tobacco pipe from his breast pocket and filled it with leaves. When I lent him a light, he closed his eyes while inhaling the smoke. Raleigh's hand trembled slightly. "But it's not." Raleigh opened his eyes again and told me, "The Spanish military flags that were raised everywhere have been lowered. The flags were lowered. This means it's not just a dimension of violence that flares up and dies down. It's a strike against symbols and a strike against what they represent. There are many other circumstances that I'll tell you about in more detail later. In any case, even thinking as conservatively as possible, this is not a simple disturbance. All cities in Florida have been paralyzed." His words were clear. This is something more. It was astonishing. Even though people are gathered around several strongholds, the Spanish colonial population is only tens of thousands, so the population density is still sparse. The native population is experiencing a rapid decline due to disease. Nevertheless, all of Florida has begun to shake. In Raleigh's words, something more than a simple disturbance was happening. How Florida was currently boiling, how it was being turned over, we could hardly imagine. Santa Lucia was a pioneer settlement with a coastal fortress and missionary base where about 1,200 people lived. About 1/6 of the residents were members of the infantry company that pioneered the place, and its governor was also the commander of that company. The governor of Santa Lucia quickly identified signs of rebellion being reported simultaneously from all directions and concentrated about 200 troops to carry out village-level sweeping operations. However, the Spanish troops dispatched from Santa Lucia soon reached their limits. The speed at which the rebellion spread was much faster than expected. There was no organized movement. Rather, it spread as one or two escaped slaves headed to another village, quickly igniting anger like fire catching on oil, which made suppression more difficult. Several villages that didn't receive protection from soldiers knocked on the doors of the Santa Lucia City Council, sending petitions. Residents of various villages banded together to form vigilante groups. It was a moment when the governor's police authority was being violated. There were also conflicts with the Indians because they were entering and exiting Indian territories. The governor was troubled by this. At this rate, there was a high probability of being censured by the Florida governor residing in San Agustin, and it was also difficult to suppress the rebellion of rampaging slaves. Wait! While racking his brain, the governor soon came up with a decent idea. Residents of each village who possess weapons can voluntarily organize and operate vigilante groups if they report to the governor. Just put the vigilante activities under his jurisdiction. Although Indians, angered by the rampaging vigilante activities, expressed various complaints, it didn't matter much. Once he recognized the vigilante activities and supported them with weapons, the slave rebellions also seemed to gradually subside. The governor, satisfied, submitted a report to the governor-general. The governor of San Jose orders, immediately, residents in the vicinity shall organize vigilante groups to control recent deviant behavior. To the citizens of San Anton and residents of its affiliated areas, in the face of current slave rebellion activities. And soon, such groundbreaking measures began to spread to other cities and regions. Florida had an overwhelming number of troops compared to other colonies. Also, the vigilante groups organized in various places centered around city citizens enabled quick responses to rebellions. In this trend, vigilante groups, indeed, they seem to be organizing them everywhere. Yes, they appear to be effectively suppressing the slaves' uprising. Currently at 4 fortresses. How about organizing them here as well? Pedro de Ibarra, the governor of Florida, who was also wary of the rebellion's northward movement, followed suit. The citizens, who were already anxious, immediately organized vigilante groups in San Agustin and its surroundings and reported back. Thanks to this, Pedro could spend time and resources on defending against attacks from returning English pirates instead of allocating troops to nearby disturbances. Everything seemed to be running efficiently. Pedro clicked his tongue and asked his aide, "I don't understand. Why do those things start rebellions? Because they have nothing to lose? Isn't life an asset? Perhaps it's because they haven't learned enough to obey authority? I still don't understand. What are they doing this for?" They shook their heads, unable to understand those who rushed toward death. They soon began a simple meeting. Perhaps it's the machination of those heretics? That's highly probable. About what caused the slaves' uprising. Then, is the answer to push harder for the eradication of devil worship? That's probably right. About how to prevent slave uprisings. But their conversation never reached the core. They were ignorant. Scratch, scratch. Done. 8 slaves, 2 Indians, 1 Spaniard. Is this all the members of this household? There are a total of 4 muskets. Exactly, haha. In the land of Florida, where literate people were rare, priests and monks were also valuable administrative personnel. Father Alonso Garcia was requisitioned under the orders of the San Agustin governor, and like other priests, went from house to house counting the number of slaves, firearms, and other items in each household. Do you, perhaps, need an escort? These days, San Agustin is quite turbulent. What do you mean by turbulent? Besides the slave rebellion, having numerous armed men running around makes people tiresome, doesn't it? It might be difficult if you encounter vigilante members while walking. Ah, I understand. I always take your words to heart, Father.
Miguel,
Come here. Escort the father to the cathedral. Yes, master. Following his master's command, a sturdy slave named Miguel followed Alonso as he turned to leave and walked out to the street. Once they were far enough away, he whispered to Alonso, "It's true. After treating the master well for a few days, he even let me out of the house like this." Miguel's voice was excited, and his face was flushed. If this continues, escape might not be such a distant possibility. Shoo! Quiet. Alonso silenced the excited man. However, Miguel's face was still flushed, and there was no way to hide his excitement. Even though he kept his mouth shut, he didn't stop sending grateful smiles toward Alonso. Since his close friend had been beaten to death by their master, he had been continually depressed, so Alonso found it awkward to discourage him. Don't expect too much. Several pathways have been blocked recently. Pathways referred to routes for freeing slaves. San Agustin, as the core of the Florida colony, was a dangerous place while also being where the most information leaked and was exchanged. Paradoxically, it was the place where the most slaves could be freed. Chapter 235. Tree of Liberty. 6. Nevertheless, several pathways had been blocked. No new ones had been created recently. This showed how much security had been strengthened lately. Despite Alonso's words, Miguel just nodded his head as if honored, never losing his smile. Don't worry too much. Somehow, there's always a way, isn't there? Alonso knew that his optimism was recent. After nearly dying several times from his master's abuse, he had brightened dramatically since meeting Alonso. On the surface, it was because Alonso was known as a priest who was kind to slaves, so Miguel could get free time and pocket money under the pretext of escorting him. And in reality, it was more than that. Miguel had revived from a near-death state after hearing about the pathways from Alonso. He had even become more diligent in his work. Pleased with this, his master often entrusted Miguel to Alonso, and others also requested that their slaves meet Alonso. They didn't know why their slaves had suddenly become so vibrant. They too were ignorant. Anyway, as Alonso and Miguel walked, they soon stiffened their faces. Shouts and sobbing. Dozens of Africans were trembling in a line in front of the square. Around them, more than a dozen people walked around with guns and swords. The vigilante group. I didn't do anything. Please call my master. Many slaves trembled in fear or groaned. The vigilante members occasionally lightly kicked slaves whose posture slumped or shouted to maintain an oppressive atmosphere. Following the governor's orders, they would confiscate slaves' possessions or beat them during such inspections. Even the masters of these slaves were either intimidated by the vigilante members' actions or had joined them, so there was no one to stop them. Most of them were drunk in broad daylight. They probably had been drinking heavily since the previous night. Alonso kept his gaze lowered as he hurried with Miguel toward the cathedral. He bowed his head, feeling the gazes of several slaves directed at him. Then, I was sent on an urgent errand. This item isn't mine. It's my master's. Please let me. A blade flashed. A slave who was protesting the inspection screamed. When Miguel and Alonso turned toward the scream, they saw a slave being beaten and crying. It seemed someone had drawn a sword and was threatening a slave. As the slave curled up into a ball to avoid having his possessions taken, the vigilante members surrounded him and mocked him. After a while, when the slave still didn't hand over the item, their laughter subsided. When more time passed and the slave still didn't give up, irritation crept into their voices. They started kicking instead of punching. The man coughed up blood. Wait, just a moment. All eyes turned to Alonso. Alonso shouted, withstanding the fierce gazes of the vigilante members. That slave often runs errands for his master. I know that master well. So, father, leave. The vigilante members muttered among themselves. Who is this guy? Oh, that priest who preaches not to beat slaves. Ah, that one. Momentarily hesitating as dozens of gazes glared at him, Alonso turned his head when he felt someone grabbing his arm. Father. It was Miguel. His face was terrified. He whispered, "What if they harm you, father? If that happens?" While Alonso hesitated, there was suddenly a slicing sound. Turning his head urgently, he saw a knife stabbed into the back of the man who had been crouching until just a moment ago. Alonso's eyes wavered. Seeing his wavering eyes, the vigilante members seemed confused and said to the man who had drawn the knife, "Hey, what if you kill him? What if the master demands compensation?" The man with the knife replied, "Then, we'll compensate," and he gave Alonso what seemed like a mocking smile. Feeling as if his blood was rushing backward, Alonso tried to walk toward him. Miguel grabbed him again. He whispered, "Father, please think of me and the other slaves, please." Alonso's fist clenched and then relaxed. The man with the knife tried to resume the inspection, leading the vigilante members. Alonso felt cold sweat on his forehead. The first time is difficult, but from the second and third times, even killing becomes easier. And what he had just witnessed was the first killing during an inspection he had seen. They would soon become accustomed to killing. They would laugh it off, saying it's fine to kill another slave as long as they compensate. They would no longer be surprised. This can't go on. Father. Ignoring Miguel's voice, Alonso approached the man with the knife. He was threatening and harassing a female slave with his knife. This time, his colleagues didn't even try to stop him. Judging by that, the woman seemed to be someone's slave among them. When the man shrugged, someone even burst into laughter. "Stop!" And Alonso, approaching the vigilante members, said, cold, refined anger was frozen in every syllable. "You aren't even contributing to stopping the rebellion. You're just killing people to vent your anger and causing pain. You are. Didn't I tell you to leave earlier?" The man with the knife glared at Alonso. Alonso pulled the arm of the woman who had just been threatened, drawing her behind him, and replied, "Didn't I tell you to stop earlier?" Alonso answered, clenching his fist. The faces of the vigilante members hardened. The faces of the ignorant hardened. Alonso thought, they are foolish. They think they can control people through fear. Alonso glared at those ignorant ones, and he looked at the slaves beyond them, those terrified, those who couldn't even resist the violence that suddenly befell them. No, they aren't terrified. They are. Half-drunk vigilante members approached Alonso, hiccuping. All sorts of vulgar curses flowed from their mouths. The slaves watched the scene, terrified. Surely they wouldn't harm the priest. Surely they wouldn't harm him. And one of the drunk vigilante members struck the back of Alonso's head. Thud. He held a blood-stained hammer in his hand. The vigilante members, who had only intended to scare the priest a bit, approached him in surprise. "Hey, are you crazy? Harming a priest? Do you know what you've done?" The man with the hammer staggered and grinned. "That bastard made me angry. The slave guys are disrespecting us. We need to scare them like this so they'll listen to us. They were ignorant ones." Their conversation wasn't completed. Thwack! The man with the hammer widened his eyes for a moment and then touched the back of his head. Blood came out. As he turned his gaze, Miguel, who had thrown a stone, was rushing toward him with bare fists. When other vigilante members hurriedly tried to stop Miguel, other slaves rushed in. They were ignorant ones. They believed that fear governs people. They believed that slaves obeyed them because of fear. They were wrong. The slaves no longer saw fear. They saw Alonso fallen and bleeding. They saw the overturned path to escape. They saw the priest who had been preaching to slave owners not to abuse their slaves. They saw the person who had been like their last lifeline. People cannot live without hope for life. The vigilante members still didn't know this and only saw dozens of slaves rushing at them. They were ignorant. The governor of Florida, the man with the knife, the man with the hammer, all were terribly ignorant about people. Crack, thwack, crunch. They would probably remain ignorant forever. Chapter 236. Tree of Liberty, 7. Pain spread from Alonso's head throughout his entire body. At the same time, his whole body wouldn't move properly, as if it had fallen into a deep sleep. Sharp pain like a knife and drowsiness that spread like clouds gave contrasting sensations as they penetrated Alonso's entire body. Through blurry eyes, he witnessed a chaotic scene. More than a dozen men armed with guns and swords were being mercilessly beaten by dozens of people armed with only stones and bare fists. The muskets of this era were good for hunting animals and intimidating the ignorant, but not suitable weapons against enemies approaching at close range. Swords, too, were difficult to wield properly in the midst of dozens of people fighting in a tangled mass. They couldn't handle those who desperately bit with their teeth, hit with their fists, and kicked with their feet. That's how the vigilante members fell one by one. Likewise, even more slaves fell. In the street that suddenly became chaotic, spectators and passers-by fled in terror. And then, look, the slaves killed the vigilante members. This is San Agustin, the place with the most soldiers prepared in Florida. After a few minutes, dozens of armed soldiers rushed in, cutting through the crowd. Unlike the vigilante members, they were properly armed with breastplates and more accustomed to killing. They appeared as the final variable in a fight that was nearly finished. The slaves, who had seized the guns and swords from the vigilante members and were covered in blood, began to scatter and flee among the crowd. They believed Alonso's body would be left behind. Gee, good heavens! Father! Father! In the midst of this, heavy hands picked up his body. A broad back carried him. Alonso just watched the scenery changing rapidly as he felt his whole body shaking as if he was going to vomit. As his consciousness and vision gradually blurred, he began to lose his judgment. When he blinked, it was a different place. Governor. Now slaves are causing a disturbance in the square area, just when the Indians are becoming rebellious. Should we recall the troops? Pedro de Ibarra, the governor of Florida, did his best to calm the riot in the capital. And fortunately, he succeeded. Half of it, at least. Father Alonso wasn't originally a very famous person. He was just a priest who was kind to some slaves around him. At most, only a few dozen to a few hundred slaves in San Agustin had goodwill toward him. Because of such a priest, suddenly in San Agustin, at a coastal fortress where 500 troops were stationed, the first riot by slaves broke out. He needed a story, if only to reassure the citizens. Fortunately, after searching his belongings and his room, a story was quickly created. Alonso Garcia, a traitor who colluded with foreign powers to help slaves escape during peacetime, eventually led slaves in rebellion in San Agustin but was suppressed. He fled somewhere. The governor considered all elements of this story perfect. Satisfied with the story he had pieced together, he spread wanted notices for Alonso Garcia to all stronghold cities in Florida. It contained all the elements that would anger patriotic slave owners. Slave escapes, rebellion, and flight. Slave owners would remember that a riot had occurred even in the capital where the governor resided, becoming more vigilant, and the military forces across the region would also focus on suppressing slave uprisings. However, the governor couldn't think of the opposite. Slave escapes, rebellion, and flight. If all the elements of that story were turned upside down, it contained all the elements that slaves would cheer for. A priest who worked to help slaves escape eventually incited rebellion and succeeded in escaping. As the governors wanted notice spread throughout Florida, slaves could also learn of this news. Soon, wildfire-like anger covered Florida in the spring. After a moment of contemplation, Alonso raised his upper body. Surprisingly, his body felt light. It was a modest room. Curtains covered the windows, and the only furniture was a bed, a desk, and a chair. It was the room where Alonso usually stayed. Someone was sitting at the desk, facing the wall. As Alonso tried to speak, The person turned his head first and said, "You're awake." It was Bishop Sebastian of San Agustin. "This is, as you can see, where you should be. Your home. The dormitory attached to the cathedral. The place where you've been for the past decade. Comfortable, isn't it? Did you save me, Bishop? But you're wanted on charges of inciting a slave rebellion." As expected, Alonso lowered his head. A slave rebellion. Clearly, many people must have died. Because of him. Because he couldn't endure a moment of anger. He had fallen critically ill. The slaves at the scene had confronted the vigilante members, and eventually many people died and were injured. Most of the slaves had probably died. Distressed by this fact, Alonso's hands trembled. He clutched his head. Sebastian approached and patted his shoulder. "Don't blame yourself too much. Although your mistake was significant, you couldn't have known that some drunk would attack a priest. Could you? Of course you would have known. How thoughtless passion and a sense of justice can create such tragedy." Sebastian poured a glass of wine, handed it to Alonso, and said, "You certainly worked for the slaves. But look, how many slaves did you help escape? 100? 200? Because of you, hundreds, thousands of people will now die." Bishop Sebastian's voice was somehow both gentle and cold. Alonso kept his mouth shut at the criticism. "Didn't I tell you? You're a priest. Your job isn't to wash and feed each slave one by one. It's to clean and feed their souls. What if you had accepted reality and persuaded slave owners in various places where slavery flourished? If you had told them not to abuse their slaves and to treat them with love? How many more lives could you have saved?" Alonso flinched at Sebastian's words. Sebastian glanced at him while quietly looking out the window and continued, "If you had taught the slaves how to obey their masters and ensured their souls could go to heaven, in the end, so much blood wouldn't have been spilled." "Bishop, what is it?" Bishop Sebastian was a good and upright person. He was also someone who had told Alonso, who opposed slavery, to wake up to reality. "I cannot do that," Alonso said to him, raising himself as much as possible from the bed. He rubbed his furrowed brow with his finger. His head hurt, and his anger was boiling inside him again. Sebastian said that if that's the case, it would be better to shed less blood. Then Alonso replied, "If that's the case, it would be better if blood flows. Equals. He tried to save us. Until the moment he fell, he tried to save those who were slaves. So, now it's right for us to continue his will."
Miguel shouted.
He still remembered the hope that Alonso had planted in him. The hope of escape, the hope that they could overcome this despair. And he remembered everything until the moment that hope completely flew away as Alonso's body collapsed. From the moment hope disappeared, his mind was filled with anger. Anger toward those who crushed hope, suppressed despair and frustration. He clenched his fist. He shouted what he had been thinking since fleeing San Agustin with Alonso's body on his back. "We will not stop until slavery disappears from this land." That led to a battle cry. Many people raised the muskets and swords they had taken from their masters, shouting their own stories along with him. Chapter 237. Tree of Liberty, 8. Numerous rebels who had come up from the south, crowds that had gathered from all over Florida, became a great wave advancing on San Agustin. A single martyr whose name became known directed the march of slaves who had been moving indiscriminately toward a single place. Left them with just one goal, toward a city protected by well-armed fortresses, to a place guarded by hundreds of armed soldiers. And within San Agustin, whispers gradually grew louder. "I clearly saw it. Father Alonso never incited them to rebel. He was only trying to stop the excesses of the vigilante members. Since the incident occurred in San Agustin, witnesses couldn't be silenced. Moreover, Alonso was a priest with a good reputation. Other priests and missionaries dispatched to the area continued their protests against the governor until several were detained, then quieted down. On the surface, good heavens, vigilante members can stab someone to death in the middle of the street, And we can do nothing? Where are the 10 Commandments? Where is justice? None of the vigilante members were punished. Justice is not to be found with the governor. They muttered in shock. Just then, a massive wave of slave rebellion was approaching San Agustin. They quietly whispered and made their plans. Some left the city to join the slave rebel forces. Some joined hands with slaves in the city to try to open the fortress gates but were caught and executed. Some held protests in the name of God and were beaten and dragged away by slave owners. Nevertheless, their anger became increasingly clear. That anger could not be suppressed. Don't you understand? Even without me, the rebellion was inevitable. How could people not rise up when injustice flows like water and justice has dried up like a river? Unjust. You could say that. Bishop Sebastian spoke, his eyes shining sharply. Equals. But not everyone can live enjoying freedom equally. Some rule and some are ruled. You pledge loyalty to His Majesty the King, and His Majesty rules over you from above your head, doesn't he? Your words are sophistry. Not everyone can be free. Yes, that might be right. Alonso clenched his fist and rose from the bed. Then, striking the desk where Sebastian sat with his chin propped up, he said, "Then, slave owners cannot be free either. They should not be given the power to abuse slaves as they please and use them as they wish. That's why I told you to educate and persuade the slave owners." Education? Persuasion? This isn't a matter for education and persuasion. Anger was evident in each of Alonso's words. He refuted Bishop Sebastian more firmly than ever. The freedom to hurt and abuse others without reason is something humans cannot possess. Those who calmly claim such a thing, I cannot tolerate them. Equals. Today, too, he worked out routes to extract slaves by land, and through various Spanish collaborators, gathered people and sent them to Virginia through those routes. They would be able to live enjoying freedom in Virginia, celebrating abundance. It was a life slaves had never thought of before. The priest rejoiced at the thought of them living happily for the rest of their lives. I heard there's a tremendous battle happening near San Agustin. I need to go there. These were the words heard by a member of what Kin Issei had established and simply called an underground organization. A priest. Before him were people of various ages, from energetic young men to middle-aged adults. He asked them honestly, "Are you in your right mind? If you just follow that path, you can live a happy life from now on." So what? Are you telling us to leave dying people behind? That Spanish priest didn't do that. And are you telling us to endure this anger? This anger we want to return to those who have insulted and abused us all this time. At those words, the priest couldn't give any answer. Many people reversed course from the route and rushed to San Agustin, to where their help was needed. And numerous priests and deacons also rushed in. Over there are the leaders of the oppressors. Over there we can gain our freedom. It was a great paradox. Many people rushed there to spill their blood. And the gates of the fortresses surrounding San Agustin opened. Equals. The two looked at each other in silence. Finally, Alonso said to Sebastian, "Thanks to your words, I no longer regret. Thanks to your words, I know that what I did was indeed the right thing. Even if I could go back to that time, I would still try to stop those vigilante members. Even at the cost of bloodshed, I would tell people to seek freedom." Sebastian silently looks at Alonso after those words. Then he adds one thing. "Then, let me ask you one thing." "Yes. When did I die?" "What?" "Well, 3 years ago." He was a good and upright person. He was also someone who had told Alonso, who opposed slavery, to wake up to reality. He was Alonso's superior and teacher. A mistaken teacher. "Where are you now? Where did you last lose consciousness?" "In San Agustin, while escaping on someone's back." The surrounding scenery distorts. Alonso blinks again. It was an unfamiliar room. Many people were looking down at him. There were people he had seen before and people he didn't know. There were slaves, clergy, and underground organization members who had helped him free slaves. He briefly pulled back the curtain covering the window. Then many crowds looked up at him. Alonso could tell where this was. This was the place that was once the governor's residence of Florida. To be honest, I didn't think this was possible. Raleigh quietly shook his head and handed me the report. San Agustin was surrounded by 6 fortresses, had 500 troops stationed, and was a city Spain had built with care. That it could fall like this. It happened. I, too, couldn't imagine it would come to this when organizing the underground. I erased Spanish Florida from Spanish Florida on the map in my hand, and slowly, I estimated the distance between Mexico City and San Agustin by 2,140 kilometers. I bit my lip for a moment, thinking about how fast ships of this era were, and how quickly military forces could be mobilized in this era. Walter. Yes. How much can the enemies mobilize? Even without saying what and how much would be mobilized, Raleigh seemed to understand without hindrance. After maintaining silence for a moment, Raleigh told me, I don't. No, I really can't tell. Cannot be known. They lost a colony where thousands of subjects lived in an instant. Then how many troops, how many ships will the Spanish Empire mobilize? How will they strike down Florida? The tree of liberty has just taken root, and a storm would rush in to uproot that tree. The next day, the assembly was convened again. Chapter 238. Fire Chariots. 1. Alonso Garcia had been critically ill for several weeks. It was close to a miracle that his half-dying body barely survived, and despite people washing and feeding him in various ways during that time, it was inevitable that he would become emaciated. It took several days for Alonso to stagger but maintain his balance, and weeks for his sunken cheeks to return to normal. It was quite a rapid recovery for someone who had stepped back from the threshold of death. Considering this also a miracle and blessing, he heard the news from those who had nursed him. As was visible, San Agustin had fallen. The troops maintaining the colony had either surrendered, died, or fled to the sea. And with the news of San Agustin's fall, other strongholds in Florida collapsed in succession, and eventually Spain's hegemony within Florida crumbled. Thus, the rebellion ignited by Alonso had won. Alonso remained stunned for a while after hearing that news. Anyone would react the same way if they woke up from near death to hear that the whole world had been turned upside down because of them. Alonso had been holed up in the former governor's residence for rehabilitation, but looking out the window, he could see at least dozens to hundreds of people who had come to see him. Look, it's that priest. It's Father Alonso. He's alive. Such shouts were constantly heard. It felt strange. He hadn't done anything, yet he had somehow become a symbol of conscience and the focal point of revolution. Just for helping slaves escape and being a bit kind to them, he was treated like a saint. Stories about him spread widely after being colored and exaggerated. A priest from a remote backwater who was ignorant of the world suddenly became an important person. It was impossible not to lose his sense of reality. Still felt like a dream. Anyway, a new leadership naturally stepped in to San Agustin after the Spanish army retreated. The slaves from southern Florida who initially triggered everything, the slaves from northern Florida including San Agustin who joined them after hearing about Alonso, several clergy and soldiers who reportedly opened the doors and disrupted the inside during the battle for San Agustin. An assembly of their representatives maintained order in San Agustin. They were the new government of this land. The newly awakened Alonso had also slipped into their ranks. And their conclusion was clear. Spanish suppression forces will sweep in within a few years at the latest. England is our only potential ally to ask for help. But I've heard England is currently at war with Catholic coalition forces and Spanish troops in Ireland, so it's difficult to receive help. A former colonial official who knew something about how the world across the ocean works spoke. People looked around with sighs, hoping someone would show insight. There was no answer from anyone. Weapons were limited to those used by the former occupying forces and slave owners. Naturally, they were far from enough to arm all the slaves. Gunpowder and iron implements were also lacking. The colony, which had grown abnormally fast over the past decade, was far from self-sufficient. Now that connections with the home country were cut off, everything would be in short supply. Armaments, army, organization, everything. It was fortunate that they had at least settled relationships with various Indian tribes without major conflicts. If conflicts had arisen with them, they would have wasted resources bickering with the Indians and then faced the Spanish army. Anyway, the fate facing these newly liberated people wasn't particularly hopeful. In fact, it was harsh. They had to worry about survival just a few years ahead. The meeting disbanded without much achievement. Alonso returned to his room with a cane and others' help. Lacking energy, he was about to lie down on the bed without even changing his clothes when, "Look this way!" He almost screamed. As Alonso staggered and sat on the bed, someone in his room was watching him from a corner. A message from the bishop. Bishop. Surely this wasn't referring to the Catholic Bishop of San Agustin who had fled with the Spanish troops. It was the bishop of the underground organization. The organization that had been helping slaves escape with him all this time, and whose members had made numerous contributions during this war, helping the uprising spread throughout Florida. An organization likely to have connections to England. Several of its members were positioned in the new leadership, but the bishop himself didn't participate, which made Alonso curious, and now he had come to visit. "What did the bishop say to me?" Alonso asked. "It's a message for not just you, but other leadership members as well." The messenger answered in a dry voice. "Virginia will help you." Virginia? Yes. They had been helping slaves escape to that place all this time. But Alonso couldn't really know what kind of place it was. Some said it was a land where a great empire flourished, others said cities of gold were lined up, while others said it was just a barbaric realm where Indian villages were scattered. There was evidence for all these claims, making it impossible to discern the truth. He had only sent slaves there thinking that a land ruled by a benevolent Indian monarch would be better than this land filled with evil. But that place is helping us as an independent power, not as an appendage of England. Why? Alonso had to ask. In fact, it was something he had been curious about for a long time. What kind of place is Virginia? And what kind of person is its emperor? To struggle so hard to save slaves from a distant foreign land. And the messenger's expression changes at Alonso's question. With a face tinged with a smile, he speaks as if it's entirely obvious. Because he said it was the right thing to do, and he opened the door and left the room. Through the open door, Alonso saw that no one in the corridor asked who he was or stopped him. Everyone in the corridor seemed to be a member of the organization. Equals. The head of the Florida organization has conveyed that, as you advised, they will not participate in forming the government. They said they reluctantly allowed some deacons and priests to participate individually. That's sufficient. I stretched as I listened to the report from Florida. I was tired from having many concerns lately. Whatever happens, Florida is a newborn country. If our secret society infiltrated and formed the government there, it would be no different from controlling puppets. Our secret society is an organization focused on intelligence and slave escapes, like the Underground Railroad of the distant future. It's enough to help them from behind. As I cracked my neck joint making a popping sound, Raleigh, who had just entered the meeting hall with other apostles, came and asked, "Did you sleep here?" "Yes." Chapter 239. Fire Chariots. 2. This was Chesapeake's government building, so to speak. A place where the Council of Six and I held meetings and conducted official business. Having slept for a long time in an awkward position there, my whole body was screaming in pain, so I did some simple stretching. My body recovered instantly. Wow, a body that doesn't need to worry about scoliosis. Anyway, I said to Raleigh while swallowing a yawn, "There are so many things to think about. I thought it would be better to stay here rather than waste time going back." The things to think about were obvious. Florida. How much time did you predict we have left? At least a year or more. Yes. With so much time, we also have a lot to prepare. The Viceroyalty of Nueva España doesn't have powerful enemies around it. At most, they just need to fend off petty English and French pirates and control dying indigenous peoples. Therefore, forces numbering in the hundreds to thousands are just scattered all over a vast land, where millions live. The military power of Nueva España will probably not be seriously inflated until other powers begin full-scale advances into America. So even if all the regular troops of Nueva España were combined, they would be insufficient to properly attack Florida. It will take a long time for them to properly gather their capabilities, complete invasion preparations, and start a second war. But that, we also have a long way to go before we're prepared. Isn't that right? There's too much to prepare. There's no way to wage war right now. This means we have no preparation beyond the means to defend when enemies directly invade this land. I sigh and say, it's understandable that weapons are lacking. But without Spanish seamen, we don't even have soldiers, do we? No one knows who should fight or how. What? No one to fight? What do you mean by that? What? The person who interrupted me and asked was, Of all people, it's Oytoten. How did that person become a council member? Well, he sold a lot of goods in France and also sold everything he took to the natives, achieving numerous diplomatic successes. He's the only person in this land resembling a professional diplomat, and he even serves as the head of the Agricultural Knight Order. Annoyingly, Oytoten was competent in peculiar areas, so now I'm facing him as a council member. I sighed and said to Oytoten, we have many native warriors, of course. We could probably mobilize thousands. But confronting Spanish troops with their bows and spears would be suicidal. Of course, without machine guns, one could say the power gap between Europeans and non-Europeans isn't that severe yet. But what I'm talking about isn't simply about power. The difference between stone axes and steel swords is significant, of course. But there's an equally important issue. They are accustomed to waging war to annihilate opponents under a unified command, in units of thousands to tens of thousands. And they also have personnel trained solely for war. Organization, training, things like that. Spain, in particular, is a nation that boasts one of the largest standing armies in Europe. They can never be underestimated. Don't we have such people too? Is he going to say something strange again? Although about 20 years have passed since our first meeting, the image of Oytoten fixed in my mind is still that of the young house-poor gambling addict from the beginning. How persuasive could the words of such a person be? Still, thinking that I shouldn't ignore him since he's a council member, I rested my chin on my hand and nodded at Oytoten's words. Oytoten excitedly said, we have our knight order too. See? He's saying something strange again. That's true, but we only borrowed the name from there. Not for that purpose. We often fight wild beasts, and we're also skilled at riding horses because we need to cultivate large areas. Also, apprentices follow the orders of knights, knights follow the orders of captains, and captains follow the orders of the knight commander. Why can't we fight people? Sounds plausible, but So if our hundreds of Knight Order members advance against enemies, driving those tractors, and defeat the enemies, how exactly? This doesn't seem right after all. Steam tractors are slow, moving at just a brisk walking pace, and they're not easy to turn. They weren't made to attack anything in the first place. But didn't you, Mr. Nemo, drive an excavator against Spaniards? That's because it was fast and maneuverable. Even if it wasn't made for attacking, couldn't it be used that way? I thought he might present some plausible opinion, but he's just making an absurd argument about using agricultural steam tractors in war. No matter how I think about it, it doesn't make sense. How could tractors that move just slightly faster than a person walking briskly be weapons? A tractor unit? That's a good idea. Walter. Huh? No, thinking about it, it's clear. It can't help but be good. What's this all of a sudden? Think about it, Mr. Nemo. What if those massive tractors moved surrounded by Lexan and iron plates on all sides? If we surround them with Lexan and iron plates, Well, it would be safe from enemy attacks. But, why can't I think of any disadvantages? Imagine driving those tractors into the middle of the enemy. Is there anything better for breaking infantry formations? There isn't. If our infantry moved behind those tractors, wouldn't that automatically provide cover? That's right too. Moreover, if such objects advanced at the forefront, they would naturally instill intimidation in the enemies. I understand now, Baron. That's right, Vicente. Right. Come to think of it, it seems familiar. What if we attach cannons or blades to attack the enemies? Eleanor, that's a very good idea. That's a tank and an armored vehicle. Wait, there must be some limitations. Similar concepts had existed since ancient times, but they weren't properly realized until the 20th century. There must have been a clear reason for that. Surely, power. What did you say? Nothing. Found the limitation. Until the 20th century, there was no power source to propel such heavy vehicles on land. But now we have it. We made steam engines. I turned slightly toward Oytoten. Amazing, Oytoten. Such insight. It's nothing. Thanks to you, the history of warfare is about to change. It's nothing. You're a genius. It's nothing. His shoulders have ascended to heaven. Apart from feeling somewhat annoyed, I was dumbfounded. Really, is it possible? Equals. Yes, Your Majesty. I've conveyed everything. And they still come forward to offer support? Yes. The Queen sipped a beverage called coffee in front of Raleigh. Then she asked, "It's an absurd question, but I'll ask since we've already experienced many absurd things. Anything, Your Majesty. Does the angel perhaps have the power to kill thousands of troops? He has not revealed such powers to us. Then why? No, how? Yes. The question, how, should precede why. This community has fewer people than Italian small states. If you draft even a few thousand or even a few hundred, there will be few able-bodied men left in the community. That is correct. He is aware of this fact. Does he think that alone can change the course of the war? Elizabeth says with a frown. At best, you would send a few hundred. How meaningful would that be against the thousands of troops Spain sends? Then Raleigh tilts his head slightly before the Queen and smiles. You'll know what significance that has in a few days. In a few days? Yes. Mr. Nemo will invite Your Majesty, and you'll know when you come then. What will I know? Raleigh answered. Overwhelming presence. And then, attach the war implements. Attach the blades. Activate. Yes, Sir Oytoten. The Queen saw it. Kung. Overwhelming presence was made of steel. Chapter 240. Industrial Monastic Order 1. If you look at one of Leonardo da Vinci's sketches, there is a so-called circular tank with cannons attached on all sides and wooden panels covering it to protect the occupants. It moves by human power. Similarly, among the weapons designed by Conrad Kaiser, a medieval European engineer, there is a vehicle moved by horses, which is also surrounded by walls and equipped with hand cannons and blades. Unlike the two examples above, the Wagenburg war wagon was a weapon that was actually used, employed to form defensive formations to protect friendly forces. In any case, there has been a constant demand for moving fortresses that protect allies from enemies while maintaining mobility. Since the most advantageous battle is a defensive one, the idea was that if that fortress could move, one could fight advantageously against enemies anywhere. Of course, none of them ended up being widely used. According to the catalogue of Immortal Order, I wondered why this was in there. Perhaps they were trying to add tanks as weapons for the secret society. The reason is clear. How would you move it? Whether made of wood or metal, how could such heavy equipment be moved on land? It's obvious. By human or animal power, probably horses. The heavy armor plates sitting on top. The blades and gunpowder weapons piled inside. But a vehicle with just 1 to 2 horsepower simply cannot move quickly. These are not equipment with actual mobility, just significant for the fact that they move at all. However, This power problem is eventually overcome as engine technology continues to develop. During World War I, as the demand for moving bunkers capable of breaking through trenches increased, modern tanks and armored vehicles emerged. Attach the war implements. Attach the blades. Activate. Yes, Sir Oytoten. And we're doing that too.
By modifying steam-powered tractors.
Overall, there were no major structural changes from the original tractors. No, virtually nothing had changed except for adding a few pieces of equipment to the original tractors. With a few adjustments, all of those could be used for their original agricultural purpose. Transparent Lexan plates were placed around the driver's seat to protect the driver while maintaining visibility, and steel armor and Lexan were added to the front to protect the vehicle body. Of course, that wasn't all. Whoosh! Get too close, and there won't be bones left to collect. I agree, Walter. The difference between tractors and ordinary vehicles is that they supply power by attaching implements. In other words, a tractor is like a moving battery, and the implements are like appliances connected to it. Our tractors already move with seeders, harvesters, rotary tillers, and plows attached. Then naturally, with a slight modification, automatic blades can be attached to the front of the vehicle. Just modify a hay collector a bit, move it to the front of the vehicle and attach blades, and it instantly transforms into rotating blades. This can prevent enemies from approaching. A massive tank surrounded by steel and transparent shields, leading with rotating blades, approaches the enemy. It approaches, spewing black steam, making a loud noise, pouring gunfire from the gunners mounted on top. An overwhelming presence, like a monster approaching. Retreat! Retreat! Naturally, the enemy formation collapses under this overwhelming presence, and the war tractors advance slowly. On the field, a mock battle is taking place between over 100 Spanish seamen led by Vicente and the Agricultural Knight Order led by Oytoten. We are watching the battle situation from a watchtower installed nearby. A situation where Spanish seamen have just landed and faced the tractor unit. Spanish cavalry initially attempt a charge but can't properly approach due to the tractors and try to maneuver around them. They are blocked by spearmen and gunners who were prepared in advance. They also fire cannons, but the cannons of this era aren't very accurate, and no matter how slow, our tractors can move at about the speed of a person walking quickly. They can avoid it. The Spanish seamen succeeded in damaging several tractors with the cover of ship guns, but even the damaged tractors serve as excellent cover for our troops and are helpful. Thus, our victory was the scenario of this mock battle. Thud. Of course, not everything goes according to plan. Several tractors broke down when tough bushes got caught in the rotating blades. Naturally, the blades were removed and replaced with clubs. As the battle continued, vehicles that hadn't been sufficiently filled with water and fuel all stopped in their tracks. On uneven terrain, tractors became utterly useless, and there were many instances of wheels getting stuck in sand. If enemies dug trenches, the tractors could only serve as somewhat expensive cover. However, terrifying. Raleigh's one-word conclusion summarized everything. Naturally, being a mock battle, there was no actual bombardment or gunfire. The war tractors also took extreme caution to prevent potential injuries by attaching clubs and ropes instead of blades and barbed wire. Yet it was overwhelming. Those were monsters. If enemies are determined to break them, they can. If they try to surround them, they can do that too. But they can't overcome them without being terrified. Because a steel monster is approaching with the purpose of killing. I felt that way even though I know and have seen 21st century tanks and armored vehicles firsthand. Then I couldn't imagine how it would look to the 17th century people gathered here. When the mock battle ended, more than a dozen war tractors rushed toward the temporarily assembled watchtower. It felt like a black and red wave rushing toward me. Knights, captains, and Commander Oytoten, each equipped with gleaming breastplates and swords at their waists, parade before me. Behind them, hundreds of apprentices either on horseback or standing on 2 feet look up at me. When Oytoten draws his sword, they simultaneously salute me. Even the sound of collars brushing against each other, overlapping hundreds of times, created a majestic feeling. What was once just a joke and wordplay had become reality. They are the Night Order. == Several months passed from the mock battle, and the autumn of 1610 arrived. It was a time when the entire community, especially the Night Order, was busy harvesting barley and various fruits and vegetables. Moreover, the knights and apprentices now received military training several times a month, doubling their workload. Even in the midst of this busyness, military training couldn't be skipped. Everyone knew war was imminent. All Night Order members are people who have sworn to dedicate themselves to the community. Isn't that why the community people show them respect, and the community gives them immense wealth? As such, there was almost no dissatisfaction with the increased workload. No, many were excited by the thought that they had become true knights as fighters. Because of this, the knights' eyes all sparkled when they received new weapons. They stood in line under a flag modified from the White family's coat of arms, equipped with unified uniforms and armaments. Everyone was equipped with breastplates, and everyone carried guns and swords. With that alone, the Night Order was the military organization closest to a modern army in the 17th century. When their captain raised his sword and shouted a command, they all raised their new flintlock muskets. The existing matchlock muskets ignited gunpowder by touching a burning match, fuse, to the powder pan, but these flintlock muskets worked by striking the powder pan with a flint when the trigger was pulled, causing the gunpowder to explode. These flintlock muskets naturally required flint to ignite the gunpowder. And since the hammer holding the flint had to strike the powder pan when the spring was released by pulling the trigger, steel that could be made into springs was needed. Moreover, compared to the matchlock method, which directly applied a burning match, the flintlock method creates sparks on the spot, so there was a 20 to 30% misfire rate during firing. Fire!
Rat-tat-tat-tat.
It was inevitable. But in the practice firing just now, among dozens of muskets, none misfired. Again.
Rat-tat-tat-tat.
And again.
Rat-tat-tat-tat-tat.
Even as the firing continued, there were no misfires. Flintlock muskets wouldn't be properly supplied until at least the mid-17th century. Currently, even European armies were still predominantly relying on existing matchlock muskets. And since it was still the early 17th century, even those who had already entered military service didn't know how remarkable what just happened was.